All right, I'll look first to Ms. Medina. Are you ready for us to go back on the record?
I am, thank you.
Great, thank you. I will welcome back. I will go ahead and orient us and then turn things back over to Mr. Ferguson. Good afternoon. I'm Nicole Kinsey, presiding hearing officer for the Administrative Hearings Office of the State Water Board. This is the afternoon portion of the hearing on with respect to the proposed Sites Reservoir project. It's the afternoon of October 21st. And we left things off with cross-examination of Mr. Asarian and Dr. Khan. We hadn't so I believe that is where we will pick up again. And I will look to my team to go ahead and pin Mr. Asarian and Dr. Khan and Ms. Willie and Mr. Ferguson. And then we can go ahead and get started. I think it's actually not pinning. I'm told it's spotlighting, but same effect.
All right, we good?
Trying to make sure. Yes, we have Ms. Willie. I want to make sure she was here before we get started.
Okay.
We're good. Go ahead, Mr. Ferguson.
All right, thank you. Dr. Khan, I'm going to return to you and a few more questions, okay?
Right.
On page 26 of your testimony, and this continues over onto page 27 and 28, you state that there is considerable evidence that some cyanobacterial toxins can persist for long distances downstream from a reservoir, correct?
Correct.
And you make this point in response to the authority's statement that cyanobacterial toxins degrade rapidly and will not be an issue downstream, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And do you agree that Otten et al. In SCS 64, which you cite for the persistence of microcystin, found that microcystin was greatly reduced from Copco Reservoir down to the estuary from 165 micrograms a liter to 3.6 micrograms per liter?
Yes, it does decrease downstream. Correct.
Okay. And would you agree that that's about a 98% decrease?
Take your word for it without calculating it.
Okay. So would you agree that Otten et al. Did find considerable reduction in downstream concentration of microcystin?
Yep, I would agree.
Okay.
Dr. I'm sorry, Mr. Ferguson, the something et al., I didn't quite catch it.
Otten, O-T-T-E-N.
Thank you.
Dr. Khan, your study with Laura Genzoli found that microcystis concentrations at Orleans, which is downstream from Iron Gate Dam on the Klamath River, were 15% of the concentration at the Iron Gate Dam, correct?
Well, it varies over time. I mean, sometimes it's higher, sometimes it's lower.
Well, can we bring up SCS 65, which is your study with Laura Genzoli? And go to PDF page 3. Scroll down. So there in the paragraph that's in the middle of the screen now, Dr. Khan.
Yes.
You mentioned that mean concentration at Orleans was about 15%, correct?
Correct.
So your response that sometimes higher, sometimes is lower is you're making the point that that's around that mean, correct?
Yeah, that's a mean, and
yep.
We have additional years since then too. So
okay. So in this same paper, you note that the longitudinal decrease in cell density and toxic concentration is expected due to the natural death and breakdown of cells and associated toxins, correct?
Correct.
And that high water velocity and constant mixing in the Klamath from Iron Gate to the estuary creates an environment that is not supportive of algae reproduction, correct?
That's correct.
Did Otten et al. Or any study you're aware of on the Klamath um, determine that there was no degradation of microcystin from the point of release to the most downstream point of sampling?
I'm not sure I quite understand the question.
Well, are you aware of any analysis on the Klamath River system that determined that there was no degradation of microcystin from an upstream to a downstream point where sampling's been conducted?
Well, there aren't really studies of degradation. The studies relate to the cell concentration and the toxin concentrations. And at times, those can be higher downstream when they get concentrated in a certain area, or sometimes in the estuary, there'll be a bump up. So it's not, the studies weren't about the actual degradation. They're just about the changes in concentrations over longitudinally in the river.
Fair enough. Some of those studies, though, were able to track the cells that originated upstream to a downstream point through some sort of biological testing, right?
Well,
So they could connect them to the source. Is that correct?
those were the genetic studies that are referred to in the Otten paper, showing that the genetics of the downstream populations were indistinguishable from the ones that were coming out of the reservoirs upstream. They weren't the same cells per se.
Okay. Do you agree that tributary dilution contributes to a reduction in cell microcystin concentration
Yes,
at further downstream sampling points?
yes.
Okay. And I assume you're aware, based on some of my earlier exchanges with Mr. Asarian, that sites reservoir releases to the Sacramento River are anticipated to be on average about 6% of Sacramento River flow, correct?
Yeah, I followed your conversations. I
Okay.
didn't recall the 6% number, but I recall some percentage.
Okay. Well, do you recall we were discussing it wouldn't be higher than 15%, except in extreme cases?
Yeah, 15%, except for those drier, I think it was the drier years, maybe it was what I recall.
Okay. So do you anticipate with this relative difference in flows between sites releases and the Sacramento River flows, that the Sacramento River will dilute the concentration of cyanobacteria and microcystis, if any, in sites reservoir releases?
Yeah, we would expect to have some dilution from the various tributaries that come in. But I think what we see in systems in general is that it doesn't take a lot of material to collect in certain slack water areas. And as a load, if you think of it as a load, even if it's diluted and the concentration is diluted, the load, let's say, of cells to the receiving water, that wouldn't necessarily change. So even though there's dilution, it doesn't mean that there's not going to be some effect downstream. And I think we can see that in other systems for long distances downstream. But yes, there will be dilution, but it doesn't mean that you wouldn't have a public health exceedance to deal with downstream.
I think you mentioned that, well, I know you do. On page 27 of your testimony, you mentioned that certain clean tributaries on the Klamath downstream from Iron Gate provided a diluting effect by contributing more water to the river than is released from the dam during summer months.
Correct.
do you happen to know the relative percentages of flow of the water released from Iron Gate as compared to the clean tributaries you reference in your testimony?
I don't know those offhand.
I could jump into that because Dr. Khan and I have done research on the Klamath River together. I think the main point is like it varies a lot. It could be as low as a doubling of flow, like the same amount of water from the tributaries and the same amount of water from the dam. So the flow could double as you go downstream, or other times it could be, 20 times, roughly speaking. So it's just highly variable according to, the rain, the snow, the dam releases. So it's very variable.
Okay, so it sounds like you're saying, Mr. Sarian, it could be kind of 50-50, or it could be a much higher tributary flow relative to Klamath River flow.
Yes, 50-50 is basically the minimum dilution.
Yeah, okay. Dr. Khan, on page 28 at line 17, you state, quote, that HABs have emerged as one of the highest priority water quality management issues in the San Francisco estuary. And in 2022, an unprecedented HAB event caused the first documented HAB-related fish kills and widespread low dissolved oxygen event in the bay, correct?
I think I said that in the testimony summary. I'm not seeing that on page 17.
Page 28 at line
20,
17.
28. Yes, I see that. Yes.
Okay. What is your understanding of the term bay as that word is used in this citation?
Well, I think the bay in general, the Delta area plus the South Bay.
Okay. Are you aware of whether this event identified in 2022 was caused by freshwater or marine organisms?
That one was a marine organism.
So would a marine organism be expected to bloom in a reservoir and provide an inoculate that could seed downstream sources?
No, that reference was intended to be a general reference about the prevalence of HABs increasing and being an issue. And that particular fish kill is not related to what would happen in the freshwater systems. But there's also reference to HABs in general being an emerging issue, including microcystis, which is prevalent in many areas of the Bay Delta system. But that fish kill was not due to those freshwater HABs. It was due to a saltwater algal species.
Okay. So on page 28, you suggest that there's a high likelihood that any cyanobacterial cells and cyanotoxins will persist downstream if released from site's reservoir, correct?
Correct.
And as we previously discussed, you recognized in SCS 65 that high water velocity and constant mixing in the Klamath River from below Iron Gate to the estuary creates an environment that's not supportive of planktonic algae, correct?
Not supportive of their growth, yes.
Are you familiar with the flows in the Tehama-Colusa Canal, Colusa Basin Drain, and the Sacramento River?
Not specific numbers, no.
But you would you expect that they'd be moving at a quote unquote high velocity and be subject to constant mixing?
Yeah.
Okay.
I would, to distinguish persistence from growth is, I think, what you're getting at here is that those conditions would not be conducive for growth of cyanobacteria, but that doesn't necessarily mean that persistence of existing material wouldn't continue downstream. That's the point that I was trying to make.
So you recognize that perhaps those water bodies and canals would not necessarily be conducive to growth, correct?
Correct.
Even though we may see persistence.
Correct.
Okay.
The only exception to that would possibly be in some of the riverine areas if there were slack waters in places where cells might accumulate, and it would be, the mixing would be such that they could have a spurt. That would be the only exception, but there's no monitoring to show one way or the other really for that.
My final few questions are related to your testimony online, or excuse me, page 28. Excuse me, page 29 at lines 2 through 9, where you state that the site's reservoir releases represent an additional summer source of nutrient loading to fuel HABs in the Delta and potentially in the Sacramento River. Is that right?
Correct.
Do you agree that Cadella et al., which is the paper at SCS 71, cite Lehman, where Lehman found that nutrient concentrations in the bay are non-limiting and therefore not directly regulating blooms?
Yes, I'm aware that there's some conclusions to that effect.
Okay.
But they also conclude that nutrient loading to the Delta is one of the primary management goals of reducing blooms, because the idea of a limiting nutrient is a very kind of transient event where it might be not limiting in one moment and in another moment it might be. And non-limiting often refers to what species you get. And there's a lot of evidence that even if once you've crossed a certain threshold that favors a species, that if you increase phosphorus concentration, let's say that you'll have higher phosphorus, you'll have more biomass. So it's not limiting in the regard that you wouldn't have, if you took that away, that the species would go away, but it is in the sense of controlling levels of biomass.
Well, by non-limiting, I understand the study to mean that there's more than sufficient nutrient to grow the existing biomass, correct?
But that doesn't mean if you didn't add more that you wouldn't get more biomass.
Okay. Do you agree that Cadella et al. Also cite Lehman for the conclusion that while nitrogen and phosphorus can be important in controlling the blooms, that in delta estuary flow is more important?
I don't recall them saying more important, but I could agree that flow is an important factor.
Okay, but you're saying you don't necessarily agree that it's more important than nutrient?
Well, I'm just saying I don't remember exactly what they said about it is all.
Okay. Do you agree that increases in site's river flow during the months that site's reservoir will release water to the delta could help control HAB growth in the delta, given the additional water will be added and the flow that will be contributed through the system?
That's too general to really know. I think it depends on the concentrations of nutrients and loading associated with that, where it goes, whether, there's areas where it dilutes and doesn't dilute. I mean, it's certainly there's a potential for those flows to flush certain areas, but without seeing exactly what those patterns would be and where, it's hard to make a general statement that it would in all cases.
Okay, one more set of questions. I'm gonna go back to page 23. And then I will be finished. On page 23 and carrying over to page 24, you mentioned that there's been no analysis of whether variable depth release through the IO tower would balance the need to avoid methyl mercury that is projected to be high in deeper layers that potentially coincide with HABs and also meet temperature targets of for rice, correct?
Correct.
So did you review Ms. Huber's testimony?
Yes.
And do you agree that she does have a discussion in her testimony about operation of the IO tower for multiple purposes?
I know that she discussed it. I don't recall what the analysis was that she performed to determine the different depths where they might expect the various temperatures plus the methyl mercury plus the HABs.
Okay. So you're saying there's no quantitative analysis. Is that what you're suggesting?
That's what I'm suggesting.
Okay. 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 That's all the questions I have. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ferguson. We'll see if it's quickly. I'll look around the room. Mr. Soderlund, do you have any questions for these witnesses?
I do not. Thank you.
Thank you. And for the Bureau, I understand we have Ms. Mitchell. Is that correct? Is that correct? And then also, do you have questions for these
Thank you.
witnesses?
And we don't have any questions today. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ms. Mundell-Rice, do you have any questions for these witnesses?
We do not have questions for this panel. Thank you.
Thank you. With that, I will look to you, Ms. Willie. I don't have any questions. Do you have redirect for either of these witnesses?
Yes, just a couple questions.
Please.
Okay, for Mr. Azarian, on your testimony, there was a discussion around it was a 68-degree temperature on page 4, line 10. Could you explain further the purpose or reason for using that temperature in your analysis?
Yes, it is at the release point where the water comes where the water from sites would be released back into the river. The primary route is through the Colusa Basin drain to at Knight's Landing is the release point into the river, and that 68-degree Fahrenheit is the numeric criteria for that stretch of the river. As explained in my testimony, there's also the water quality criteria that a discharge cannot increase temperatures by more than 5 degrees. And then there's also the forgetting the exact terminology of it here, let me look it up. The basin plan, the controllable factors policy that says you can't have any increase in temperature, or you can't have any increase in a parameter that where you're already exceeding the water quality objectives. And so the way that the basin plan is intended to function, in my understanding, is that a violation of any one of those 3 things would be a violation of the basin plan. And so that was part of why I focused on the 68, and it's intended to the purpose of that is protection of cold water fisheries.
Thank you. And then could you elaborate or explain a little bit the results for or your findings of the exceedances for the 68 degrees Fahrenheit in September due to the site's discharges?
Yes. Could we bring up my testimony, SCS 8 or combined testimony, SCS 8 page. Let's see. It is PDF page 15. The graphs there, yeah. So, and Mr. Ferguson asked about, you know, how many days would there in the period of record that I analyzed. And one thing that I wanted to clarify, so I did count the number of days, and there are 25 additional days where the 68-degree threshold is exceeded under the diversion scenario compared to the observed flow scenario. So there's 25 additional days, and that is across 22 different years. So that's a 4% increase in those September, the days in the month of September. It's a 4% increase in the exceedance of, or sorry, 4% of the days in that were exceedances under the diversion scenario that were not exceedances under the observed flow scenario. And so, you know, 4% is not like a huge number, but it occurred in every year in which diversions were allowed to occur in September. There were only 3 years in that 22-year period in which diversions were allowed to occur or would be allowed to occur in September. And in every one of those years, there was exceedances of that 68-degree threshold. And that was, those are the good years, really. It's under the wet and above normal years when, if can we go up one page to the upper set of graphs? Or sorry, 2 more. Yep, next one, sorry, figure 2 or figure 1. 1 more page. It'll be another colored graph. Yeah, in there. So if we look at that, the left scenario, the left panel there, those days on which the September diversions are occurring are some of the highest flow years. So those are supposed to be the good years in the river when conditions are good. And when those diversions are allowed to occur in September, it instead turns those good years that are supposed to be the good years into the lowest drought flows, you know, observed in that 21-year period of record. We get the temperature exceedances, and that occurs in about 3. That occurred in 3 of the 7 wet and above normal years that were in that 21-year period that I looked at, and that was the data, the years that were available in the site's water availability analysis. So yeah, I think that's what I want to say about that. Did you have any other questions?
Thank you. I'll switch over to Dr. Khan. In this prior discussion, you mentioned, I think it was on the Klamath, that cyanobacteria, I think, were found at 12 meters. Is that correct?
Correct.
And about how many feet is that?
I think that's about 39 feet, I think.
Mm-hmm. And why would that number be significant in the effectiveness of some of the HABs reduction methods for sites?
Well, in the, I think it was in Ms. Huber's testimony, she notes where the water surface levels would be in the reservoir in dry and critically dry years, and makes some assumptions that they would be able to avoid HABs because those levels would be, the intakes would be below those levels. But if they are at 12 meters, then in those particular years, they wouldn't necessarily be able to avoid entraining algal material into the intake.
Thank you. And then just one last question. Mr. Ferguson brought up sites 291, I think is what it's cited as now. The conceptual model for nutrients in the Central Valley and Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. So that report is from 2006, and in your professional work, would you typically rely on a modeling report that was completed 18 years ago?
I might look at it for trends and so on, but I would certainly want to see more recent information that would be, closer in time to, to what we're looking at.
Okay, thank you. That's all my questions.
Thank you, Ms. Willie. With that redirect, Mr. Ferguson, do you have any additional questions?
No, thank you.
Thank you. Then I think we have completed this panel. Thank you so much, Mr. Asarian and Dr. Khan. I really appreciate your testimony today, and I appreciate you sticking with us over the lunch hour.
Thank you.
At this point, and you're now excused, thank you very much. At this point, I think we will turn, unless I'm forgetting something, I believe we will turn to, I don't know if it's Mr. Reese. Are you an opening statement for the South Delta users, or I don't know if there's more than one. I realize we're talking about multiple parties.
Good afternoon. Yes, I will be presenting the opening statement, a single opening statement for the STWA parties in general, which also includes the County of San Joaquin. And Mr. Herrick is also with me here in the room, and we're joined by Ms. Meserve remotely. So I'm ready to proceed whenever you're ready.
Thank you. Yes, please proceed.
The STWA parties include South Delta Water Agency, Central Delta Water Agency, San Joaquin County, and Zuckerman Mandeville, Inc., Delta Farms, and Rudy Moosey Investment LP, and Reclamation District 2030. STWA and CDWA were created by statute in 1973. STWA's boundaries encompass approximately 148,000 acres, and CDWA's boundaries encompass approximately 120,000 acres. The statutory purposes of the agencies include, but are not limited to, protecting the water supply of the lands within their boundaries against salinity, and assuring lands within the agency's boundaries have a dependable supply of water of suitable quality sufficient to meet present and future needs. Pursuant to their enabling statutes, STWA and CDWA may assist landowners and water right holders within their boundaries with the protection of vested water rights, and may represent the interest of those parties in water right proceedings such as this. San Joaquin County is one of the 5 counties within the legal delta. The lands within STWA and CDWA encompass all of that portion of the legal delta that is within San Joaquin County. Delta agriculture is a vital part of the county's economy, which depends on a dependable supply of water of suitable quality. The Delta is also an invaluable public trust, recreational, and cultural resource within San Joaquin County. Zuckerman Mandeville Inc., Delta Farms, and Rudy Moosey Investment LP own and farm land within STWA and CDWA, and thus are within San Joaquin County. Rec District 2030 is also located within CDWA and San Joaquin County. In concept, the STWA parties generally support projects that provide additional storage, so long as those projects don't adversely affect senior water right holders and beneficial uses within STWA, CDWA, and the county. The STWA parties are also not opposed to local water supply projects developed by and for local interests, so long as the operation of any such projects do not adversely affect water users in their area. Unfortunately, the sites project as proposed does not fit into those categories. The state and federal water projects, as well as multiple state and federal water contractors, are storage partners and beneficiaries of the sites project. The place of use of the sites project expands far beyond the local counties of origin and includes the SWP, the State Water Project, and the Central Valley Project service areas. far from the Sacramento River watershed. The site's project proposes to intercept and store flows from the Sacramento River from September 1st through June 14th, flows that would otherwise help freshen South and Central Delta channels. Thereafter, from July 1st through November 30th of each year, up to an approximate 200,000 to 300,000 acre feet a year of site's project water could be rediverted for the benefit of state and federal water contractors through the export facilities in the South Delta in a given year. As such, if sites is built, exports from the South Delta would significantly increase at a time when the health of the Delta and its fisheries are in crisis, and senior water right holders and other beneficial users of water in the South and Central Delta face increasing challenges and limitations. Granting the subject water rights application as proposed would adversely impact the STWA parties, is not in the public interest, and does not satisfy required legal obligations to protect the Delta. The STWA parties' case-in-chief testimony will show the following: that the state and federal projects already export an average of 4 million acre feet per year from the South Delta, that the site's project would lead to a significant increase in exports from the state and federal projects' South Delta facilities, that the state and federal projects periodically fail to meet South Delta salinity standards for agricultural beneficial uses, which are State Water Board required permit conditions, that the site's project would have the effect of being a permanent transfer from north to south, that water exports at the federal and state facilities in the South Delta contribute to significant decreases in water levels and reduced channel depths in the South and Central Delta, and at times interfere with irrigation by water right holders whose rights are senior to the state and federal projects, that channel depths in the South Delta appear to be decreasing from sedimentation and are negatively impacted by the operation of state and federal projects from the South Delta's facilities, that current and state federal water project exports cause increased salinity intrusion and diminished water quality in the interior Delta, that these water exports cause null zones and dead zones within the interior channels of the South and Central Delta, that the state board has not taken enforcement action against the projects. Instead, the board made the agricultural salinity standards less protective in 2018, that the projects have frequently relied on the relaxation of standards through the State Water Board's temporary urgency change process rather than planning for predictable droughts, that some of the peak flows the site's project intends to divert to storage are flows that would otherwise help freshen the South and Central Delta channels in subsequent months. In certain conditions, there can be a large gap in time between diversions to sites and the resulting water quality impacts occurring in the South and Central Delta, which has not been addressed in this application. That the negative effects of exporting sites project water through rediversion in the South Delta would be most pronounced during dry and critical years. That sites would allow the state and federal projects via the site's storage partners to increase their exports from the Delta without first satisfying their existing obligations to the Delta. That the manner in which the project proponents use the models supporting the site's application masks the impacts through the gross aggregation and averaging of output data over 82 years. That consequently, the actual changes in hydrology and water quality from implementing the site's project are not analyzed. Common sense tells us that these impacts, especially to crops from irrigation supplies and to fish from flow and temperature changes, occur in real time. That the models used to analyze a site's project are not adequate to understand sub-monthly impacts, and the models have not been updated to include current information, including the current bathymetry of certain South Delta channels. That modeling for the site's project also fails to include more recent hydrology over the last 20 years, undermining the reliability of its conclusions with respect to impacts on fisheries, as well as the ability of the project to reliably store and release water. that the ability of the project to provide any benefit to fisheries is highly questionable, and that impacts to outmigrating salmon are likely to be more negative than disclosed in the application. That the proposed permit conditions for the site's project are not sufficiently protective of users of water and the fisheries that the STWA parties seek to protect. That the site's project conflicts with existing water quality control plan, the existing water quality control plan, California Water Plan, the Delta Reform Act, and the area of origin statutes that protect uses of water within the Delta, and that sites is also not a reasonable response to climate change. Finally, that as a result of these flaws in the application, the State Water Board and the protestants are not able to assess the ability of the project to meet state law requirements. Should the project be permitted, adequate terms to protect the STWA parties' interest as well as public trust resources such as salmon fisheries must be required. Additionally, the STWA party witness suggests several permit terms in their testimony to help address these issues. Planned order of the STWA party's case and chief witnesses is as follows. Today, Mr. Herrick and I will present Greg Wilson and Tom Burke as a small two-person panel. After Mr. Burke and Mr. Wilson, there'll be Dante Nomalini Sr. and then Dr. Bruce Herbold. Joe Ratto, as I mentioned earlier, will have to be held over to probably November 4th or wherever is convenient thereafter. And finally, we will present Richard Pellegri. That concludes my opening statement on behalf of the STWA parties.
Thank you, Mr. Reese. With that, are you prepared to call the first two witnesses? It sounds like they'll present together.
We are prepared. Mr. Greg Wilson is here present in the room with us, and Mr. Burke is present remotely.
Excellent. Do you need a moment to rearrange or?
No, Mr. Wilson is here. Let me use my camera here to get him
Focused in. There we go.
Do we see him? Okay.
Yes.
I don't know why it has that's blurred out. Let's see here.
There we go.
Okay. Mr. Wilson is ready to proceed.
I think if we want Mr. Wilson on camera, it may be, Mr. Reese, that you either have to move, or it seems like you can't both be in focus at the same time and the camera is picking one or the other of you.
I'd rather pick him up.
So there we go.
How's that?
I think that's better. Thank you.
There we go.
And we're going to start with Mr. Wilson, so I can swear in the witnesses one by one as we go through them, since we have Mr. Wilson. Is that right, Mr. Reese? We're going to start with Mr. Wilson's.
That's correct.
Okay, we'll start with that. Good afternoon, Mr. Wilson. Welcome
Good afternoon
to our proceeding here. If you would please raise your right hand and I will administer the oath. Mr. Wilson, do you swear or affirm under the penalty of perjury that the testimony you will give in this hearing will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes, I do.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Reese, you may proceed with further introducing Mr. Wilson.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Wilson. Is STWA 71 a true and correct statement of your qualifications?
Yes, it is.
Is STW 72A a true and correct copy of your corrected written testimony?
Yes, it is.
Is STWA 75A a true and correct copy of your corrected summary of testimony?
Yes, it is.
And did you prepare STWA 73?
Yes, I did.
Is STWA 73 referenced in your testimony?
Yes, it is.
And it's incorporated into your testimony, correct?
Yes.
And is STWA 74 also referenced in your testimony?
Yes, it is.
And since you provided a few changes last week, which were served and uploaded, I assume that you don't have any additional changes to share before you summarize your testimony today, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, at this time, Mr. Wilson, could you please summarize your testimony?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Reese. And I'd also like to thank Hearing Officer Kinsey, the members of the board, and especially the Ms. Mullen and the hearing team and staff. I know how difficult it is to put these things on, and especially adding in Zoom. It's really impressive, the presentation that you've had. My great pleasure to appear at this proceeding today. My name is Gregory F. Wilson. Next slide. So I'll wait until there we go. Okay, this slide shows a summary of my qualifications. I just want to highlight that I was a water resource control engineer for the Division of Water Rights for 4 years in the petition unit and 8 years in the Bay Delta unit. I've acted as a member of both the hearing team and as an expert witness at State Water Resources Control Board hearings, fortunately not at the same one. And I processed a majority of cross-delta water transfers from 1999 through 2010. I'm also a named preparer of the 2006 Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan, and I was assigned to the Table 1 and 2 objectives for the protection of municipal, industrial, and agricultural beneficial uses. Next slide, please. Okay, this slide shows the scope of my testimony. I was retained by Central Delta Water Agency and the South Delta Water Agency to perform the listed tasks. I'd like to highlight first the bullet point 3 review of the inclusion of the Clifton Court Forebay and the Jones Pumping Plant as points of rediversion pursuant to application 25517. And then I'd also like to highlight that I was asked to evaluate the potential for application 25517 to interfere with existing senior water rights within Central Delta Water Agency and South Delta Water Agency, and then consider terms and conditions that should be included in the application if approved to protect the senior water right holders from injury and in anticipation of the update to the Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan. Finally, I was asked to evaluate the manner which the state board is proceeding relative to the subject assignment and if it is consistent with past practices and procedures. Next slide, please. Okay, so first I have here a quick summary of the petitions for assignment and release of priority. These petitions have been discussed in depth so far at this hearing, but I did want to note that the petitions claim not to be in conflict with the California Water Plan or with water quality objectives, and also claim not to deprive a county of origin of water necessary for development. Next slide, please. Okay, this slide lists a summary of the subject application. And just to go through it really quick, the application requests the direct diversion to off-stream storage of up to 4,200 CFS from the 2 points on the Sacramento River. It also requests the release from storage to the Sacramento River at up to 1,000 CFS for rediversion at Clifton Court Forebay or the Jones Pumping Plant between July 1st and November 30th. And delivery to a place of use that includes the entire south of Delta portions of the SWP and CVP. Also like to note the purposes of use include most beneficial uses of water and specifically water quality preservation. As I reviewed it, the application and the current draft site's reservoir operating plan do not contain any specific limitations regarding the rate of rediversion or the total annual volume of rediversion at Clifton Court or Jones Pumping Plant. Now, however, based on the site's FDIR EIS, the magnitude of these rediversions will be significant, and I put on the order of up to, and that would be a maximum annual total of about 200,000 acre feet per year during dry and critically dry water years. And then when you consider all factors related to the site's project, that number could be up as high as 350,000 acre feet. Now, I want to point out that the numbers are based on CalSim results, so they should be used with care as estimates. However, CalSim is calibrated and works best when estimating exports. Next slide, please. So in reviewing the potential for interference with senior water rights, I divided the project into 3 general areas. First, impacts to water quality within Central and South Delta due to reductions in Sacramento River flow from the direct diversion of up to 4,200 CFS from the Sacramento River to off-stream storage. And that direct diversion is proposed between September 1st and June 14th. The second general area would be impacts to water levels, water quality, and or channel morphology in the channels within Central and South Delta during the period when rediversion of water at Clifton Corder Jones is requested pursuant to the application. And this period is during the typical transfer period, July 1st through November 30th. And finally, impacts to water quality within the Central and South Delta due to increased salinity in the San Joaquin River at Vernalis as a result from the water that's rediverted or exported during the summertime period being applied to areas within the CVP place of use that drain to the San Joaquin River. Next slide, please. So let's first take a look at the impacts due to direct diversion from the Sacramento River. Now, let's take a look at the chart on the right, which shows daily flows in the Sacramento River at Verona during most of water year 2016. And this chart is taken from exhibit AHO 049B. The AHO 049B offers several different locations where it displays this information. I chose the Verona location as the best representation of potential impacts to Sacramento River flow reduction to the Delta due to the site's diversion within the hearing record. Now, to take a look at the chart is a little bit confusing. The blue line for the majority of the chart shows actually the existing flow. However, during periods of potential sites diversions, which are shown on the bottom of the chart in black, you can see that there's an orange peak and a lower blue peak in the 2 diversion periods that would have occurred during this year. And the orange peak represents the existing flow without the project, and the blue peak in those areas represents the flow with the project. Okay. Now, as you can see, the diversion, especially the March diversion, reduces the volume of the last peak of the last peak inflow to the Delta from the Sacramento River during March, and there are no further inflows or significant inflows during that season. So I'd like to call attention now to South Delta Water Agency 74, which is an article titled Artificial Neural Network for Sacramento San Joaquin Delta Flow Salinity Relationship for Calcium 3. And in this document, there's a discussion that shows that in-delta salinity depends on what's described as a long-term memory. And what this means is that conditions in the delta up to 4 months prior can affect the current day's salinity. And so the reduction in Sacramento River flow to the delta, for example, from this March diversion, the impacts to that could last for up to 4 months. So you can see how the impacts might stretch out of the range of when the diversion is actually occurring and into the summer. So as a result of this, I recommended limiting the period of diversion to the period from December 1st through March 31st. And this would have the effect of limiting some April reductions in April flows that might linger into the summer. Next slide, please. Okay, this slide takes a look at impacts to water quality, water levels, and or channel morphology due to the rediversion of water at the Clifton Court Forebay or the Jones pumping plant. Okay, we can take a look at the figure on the right. The left panel depicts the tidally averaged flow direction in the absence of export pumping, and the right panel depicts reversal of tidally averaged flows that occurs during times of high exports and low inflow to the delta. And this figure is from the State Water Board's 2017 Scientific Basis Report. It's exhibit AHO 271. It's on page 2-70 of that document. And that is PDF 118 if anybody's looking for it. It's a good this is a good representation of the impacts of rediversions at Clifton Court Forebay and Jones pumping plant during periods of high exports and low inflow to the delta. Now, as you look over to my first bullet item, the quote, italicized quote, and that quote is from the same Scientific Basis Report, page 2-71. And it talks about the null flow areas created by the reversal of tidally averaged flows that you see in the right panel, and how these null flow areas are associated with, the part I left out is dissolved oxygen, but with poor water quality. Now, the modeling so before I go on, this is a good qualitative look at what's going on in the delta during periods of exports, and you can really use this figure to kind of look at a range between less exports being more like the panel on the left and more exports or less inflow being more like the panel on the right. Now, for a quantitative analysis of the impacts of diversions and changes in flow in the delta, the Sites Authority presents calcium-2 DSM-2 modeling. And I'd like to go over quickly some of the limitations of this combination of modeling to predict the impacts that we're talking about here. Now, as we've heard numerous throughout the proceeding, calcium operates on a monthly time step. It's a planning model for predicting exports and end-of-year reservoir levels. And one thing that you'll note about these values is that they aren't very dependent on intramonthly variation. So if the model doesn't necessarily predict or pick up a little bit less pumping one week and a little bit more the other week, in the end, that's not really important to it, because what they're looking for is how much was exported during the month, what is the end of month reservoir elevations, and really what is the end of season reservoir elevations. And now some additional limitations and issues with the calcium-2 DSM-2 combination is the monthly time step versus the 15-minute interval for DSM-2. Like I said, calcium works on a monthly time step. In order to accurately predict tidal impacts, DSM-2 works on a 15-minute time step. So when you take the output from calcium-2 and then have to put it into DSM-2, you have to use a mathematical methodology or some methodology to either smooth the data so it acts more naturally, or there are some cases where the data just shows up very flatlined, for a whole month at one value and then drops to another value for another month. And this would be the inputs to DSM-2. So we can see that historically, this combination of modeling has not resulted in very accurate depictions of salinity in the South and Central Delta. Now, as a result of this, the State Water Board has ordered a monitoring special study for salinity in the South Delta. That study is ongoing. One of the anticipated end products of that study is a computer model with a really cool name called SCISM. Now, SCISM stands for Semi-Implicit Cross-Scale Hydrodynamic Integrated System Model. And there will be a quiz on that later. But this model is a three-dimensional model that is intended to more accurately depict both The variation of flow and salinity in the South Delta as a result of exports and inflows, and to attempt to take a look at identifying some of the null flow areas, where the extents of these reaches are, and what, if anything, can be done about it. Now, the schism model was supposed to be released earlier, I believe, this year, but its release has been delayed, and so we're not able to use that model for this process. As a result, I decided to take a look at the historical monitoring data as the next best option. Next slide, please. Okay. This slide is a sheet from Exhibit South Delta Water Agency 73. It is a sheet titled Old River Tracy Old, if you want to pull it up. And what it shows is the EC, or electrical conductivity, at the Old River Tracy monitoring station between the years 2008 to 2023 and the months April through November. The daily ECs at Old were taken from CDEC and then used to calculate the 30-day running average, which is then compared to the requirements in D1641. The areas highlighted in yellow indicate exceedances of the D1641 objectives at this compliance location. Now, I understand that the numbers are not exactly readable on this presentation, but I just wanted to present an easily digestible visual representation of the existing conditions. These are the conditions that water users in the South Delta have seen over the past nearly 20 years. And I think this exhibit speaks for itself. It's not exactly a good record of compliance. Now, I'd also like to note at this time that water level and channel morphology is also affected by null zones and project pumping. And more detailed information regarding water levels and channel morphology is provided by Mr. Burke. Next slide, please. So now, considering what we've seen, the question is, what do we do about it? So what I did was to take a look at other water right actions that are similar to what the site's rediversions propose. So first, let's take a look at JPOD, or joint points of diversion. And just to back up a little quick Delta refresher, the state project, or the SWP, is storage poor and conveyance rich. The federal project, or the CVP, is storage rich and conveyance poor. Therefore, the SWP can pump more water than it can store, and the CVP can store more water than it can pump. Now, if you look on pages 90 to 107 of D1641, it does a detailed description of the approval of joint points of diversion. And I also want to note that JPOD mostly involves Shasta water being exported at Clifton Court Forebay, because typically the department doesn't have extra water and the Bureau doesn't have extra pumping capacity. Okay. Now, let's take a look at water transfers. The types of water transfers I'm talking about here I defined as cross-delta stored water transfers. And these are water transfers that are water that is appropriated by parties other than the projects and stored in reservoirs and then transferred to the parties south of the Delta by rediversion at the Clifton Court Forebay and Jones pumping plant. The most prominent or most largest cross-delta water transfer is the Yuba Accord transfer, which was approved in 2008 and is approved up to a total of 200,000 acre-feet per year, and a max diversion rate at the Clifton Court Forebay and Jones pumping plant at 1,500 CFS. Now, This water transfer is currently approved and is another type of project that I look like is similar to sites rediversions. The sites rediversions consist of off-stream storage being released to the Sacramento River during the transfer window to go through the delta and be exported for delivery to the SWP and CVP. Again, it's very similar to the Yuba transfer, which is off-stream with regards to the Sacramento River. It releases water to the lower Yuba River, thence the Feather River to the Sacramento River for rediversion in the South Delta and delivery to the SWP and CVP place of use. So, and Joint Point involves water that was stored in Shasta being released directly to the Sacramento River and exported at Clifton Court 4 Bay. So while these are all different types of water right actions, they have identical impacts to senior water right holders in the Central and South Delta. But one thing I wanted to point out is that water transfers have volume and rate limitations at Clifton Court 4 Bay and Jones Pumping Plant. And most importantly, they have expiration dates. So the transfers are not effective indefinitely. They expire at a specific time. The Yuba transfer, for example, expires at the end of 2025. As we note, the sites rediversions at Clifton Court 4 Bay had no explicit limitations, but most importantly, they have no expiration date. This is a permit that would and that would be once if approved and then water was put to beneficial use, then that water would be authorized for to be put to beneficial use as long as the use was maintained. Therefore, and let me back up real quick, Joint Point of Diversion was approved in 3 stages. And so these 3 stages are stage 1, which is basically makeup water not to exceed the without joint point case, or an amount not to exceed the absent the action case. Stage 2 of Joint Point is up to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineer permits, and stage 3 of Joint Point is up to the physical capacity of the plant. Now, if you look at the sites rediversions and the sites project in general, the vast majority of the sites storage partners are CDP or SWP contractors, and therefore, if they were to divert water off the Sacramento River to off-stream storage to store in sites, and then be able to release it and redivert it either Jones or Bank or Clifton Court 4 Bay, and to be able to serve either the CDP or the SWP, what you've basically done is approved an additional form of Joint Point. And so that's why in my analysis, I concluded that sites is most like stage 3 Joint Point of Diversion. Next slide. So now we take a look at excuse me for a sec. So now I'd like to take a look at the recommended permit term for the rediversion of water at the Clifton Court 4 Bay and Jones Pumping Plant. So the first part of this term is just a preamble to explain what's being subject to compliance. So any rediversion of water pursuant to the sites project would be subject to this term. So now let's look at subdivision A. The first part of this term requiring the department and the Bureau to meet the objectives set forth in table 1, 2, and 3 of D1641 has been a requirement of all cross-delta water transfers approved since the year 2000. So, and that's was the first, from as long ago as the first cross-delta water transfer that I worked on, actually. And Now, if you go to the next part of the term, which requires compliance with the various plans and conditions required as prerequisite for the use of joint points of diversion, that terminology has been in all the cross delta water transfer orders since 2001. And when those water transfers were first approved, we were in stage 1 joint point. Now we have reached stage 2 joint point. Now, if you look down at the bullet point titled B, requiring any future order or decision adopted by the board implementing updated Bay Delta water quality objectives at Clifton Court or Jones, including future water level or water quality response plans. This term has been in all the cross delta water transfers since about the end of 2007 or 2008 with the Yuba order. And that would be the order approving the Yuba Accord transfer. And then finally, bullet point C, requiring compliance with any applicable biological opinions and any court orders related to their operations, was added around 2008 as a response to the pelagic organism decline. So you can see this permit term, the main difference here with any other similar action is that it requires the 3rd stage of joint point of diversion. And my previous discussion explained why I put that in. Next slide, please. So now let's go on to the 3rd area, which is impacts to water quality due to increased salinity in the San Joaquin River at Vernalis. And I'm going to keep this part relatively simple, just that in D1641, the State Water Board found that USBR, through its activities associated with operating the CVP in the San Joaquin River Basin, is responsible for significant deterioration of water quality in the Southern Delta. Add to that the fact that the subject application includes the inclusion of the entire Central Valley place of use south of Delta. I come to the conclusion that any incremental increase in the salinity of the San Joaquin River, no matter how small, becomes significant. And that is because if the area that we're looking at is already in question in terms of already in a state of injury, any additional injury to that then becomes significant. And so as a result of that, I came up with a couple ideas, actually. One would be to just remove the place of use of the CVP, of the areas of the CVP that drain to the San Joaquin River from application 25517. And these areas are defined in D1641 as primarily areas served through the Delta Mendota Canal and the San Luis unit. Then an alternative to this, because this might not be what the project is looking to do, would be that Central Delta and South Delta and sites could enter good faith negotiations to come into an agreement to allow for the delivery of water to drainage impacted areas of the CVP in exchange for releases of water from New Melones Reservoir to the San Joaquin River to increase the flow at Vernalis and thereby improve the water quality in the South Delta. I just want to note also that the water doesn't necessarily have to come from New Melones if it is just additional flows in the San Joaquin River at Vernalis. Next slide, please. Now, one of the things that you can see with the slide that I presented earlier with the Old River Tracy EC is that not all of the terms and conditions and permits are enforced. And so first, I'll refer back to South Delta Water Agency 73 for the history of exceedances of the South Delta water quality objectives. I also note that South Delta 73 contains 3 sheets. So there's 1 sheet for each of the 3 monitoring locations, one at Old River Tracy, at Old River and Middle River, and at San Joaquin River at Brant Bridge. Okay, now in addition to the history of exceedances, there's also a history of temporary urgency changes to affect D1641 objectives. Now, temporary urgency changes have been, these types of temporary urgency changes have been approved in the years 2008, 2014, 2015, 2021, 2022, and 2023. The temporary urgency change approved in 2008 relaxed specifically the South Delta salinity objectives that protect the water users within the Central and South Delta. The other remaining temporary urgency changes relaxed Table 3 objectives, such as Delta outflow, export limits, and San Joaquin River flows. And what is also notable about these temporary urgency changes is that the value, or that transfer water, and I put that in quotes, was excluded from the value of exports in the export limit objective calculation. And so while this has the effect of minimizing the magnitude of the actual relaxation, it's also very likely that sites water, which isn't, they're very clear, isn't project water, would also be excluded from any of the export limits contained in future temporary urgency changes. And then finally, I'd like to point out that the Yuba Accord transfer was conditioned, as I mentioned previously, and water was still exported while the objectives were exceeded at the Old River Tracy compliance station. So now let's take a quick look at the permit term I recommended. It's quite simple, just that no rediversion of water at Clifton Court or Jones Pumping Plant pursuant to this permit is authorized pursuant to a temporary urgency change requesting relaxation of any D1641 objectives or any future water quality objectives adopted by the State Water Board and implemented by order or decision of the State Water Board at these plants. So a simple term, but one that now doesn't allow sites water to be diverted while a temporary urgency change is in effect. Next slide. Now, I'd like to talk quickly about recommendations of conditions which should be included in anticipation of the update to the Bay Delta Plan. So now, responsibility for implementation of water quality objectives corresponds to the magnitude of the diversion within the watershed. And so for the sites project, this is a relatively large diversion within the Sacramento River watershed, in the order of top 5 or 6, top 10 at least. And so the corresponding responsibility for implementation of the Bay Delta Water Quality and Control Plan would be relatively high relative to other projects that were not as large within the watershed. I also want to point out that Water Code Section 10504 requires that the assignment and release of priority that's requested as part of the sites project must not be in conflict with the Water Quality Control Plan. And so because of these two factors, you kind of have a double dip here of requirements. I crafted the following term that, again, diversion of water from the Sacramento River to storage. So that would be the direct diversion to storage up at Hamilton City and Red Bluff. And the subsequent release of stored water for rediversion or export at Clifton Court and Jones Pumping Plant is subject to either A, accepting the default implementation of the objectives contained in the 2023 Sac Delta update to the Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan, or B, negotiating a separate voluntary agreement with the State Water Board. So in this sense, now the sites project would be required to meet its responsibilities under the Water Quality Control Plan that correspond with the magnitude of its diversion. Next slide, please. And then finally, taking a look at the manner by which the applicant and the state board are proceeding relative to the subject assignments. We mentioned the first three bullet items, but I want to highlight the fourth bullet item, that the board will look favorably upon petitions for release of priority or assignment of state filed applications, so long as the petitioner seeks to appropriate water for purposes and places of use consistent with the state filed application. Okay. So taking a look at the fourth bullet item, this was identified that the board will look favorably upon petitions for release of priority or assignment of state filed applications, so long as the petitioner seeks to appropriate water for purposes and places of use consistent with the state filed application. And this is a board policy that's been that was identified or delineated in previous assignments, orders approving previous assignments of state filed applications. So now in the site's original state filed application, there is a specific reference to the maps delineating the SWP place of use on file with the state board as of date of this filing, at date being September 30th, 1977. And so what that tells me is that the original intent of the state filed application was to serve the SWP place of use. And so my recommendation would be to remove the CVP place. Well, my recommendation in order to be consistent with the state filed application would be to remove the CVP place of use from any permit issued pursuant to application 25517. And I'd also like to note that the reason to remove it and the reason why this would be significant is because of the identified drainage impacts from application of water to the CVP place of use that drains to the San Joaquin River and the impacts to downstream users. If, for example, my previous term regarding a negotiated agreement that can address the water quality impacts were to be part of the proposed permit, then I believe that you could include the CVP place of use and be consistent with the state filed application, because the additional place of use is not an injury to other legal uses of water. Now, this concludes my presentation, and I don't know if you want to ask me questions now or go on to Mr. Burke.
We're gonna move your camera.
I think that, thank you, Mr. Wilson. I believe now we are moving to the summary for Mr. Burke.
That's correct. Move your camera.
Great. And I see Mr. Burke. I will ask my team to please spotlight Mr. Burke for me. Thank you. And I will go ahead and administer the oath. Welcome to our proceeding. If you would please raise your right hand. Mr. Burke, do you swear or affirm under the penalty of perjury that the testimony you will give in this hearing will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you very much. You may proceed, introducing Mr. Burke further.
Good afternoon, Mr. Burke.
Good afternoon.
Mr. Burke, is STWA 1 a correct statement of your qualifications?
Yes, it is.
Is STWA 2A a true and correct copy of your corrected written testimony?
Yes, it is.
Is STWA 6A a true and correct copy of your corrected summary of testimony?
Yes, it is.
And did you prepare STWA 3, STWA 4, and 5?
Yes, I did.
And those are exhibits referenced and incorporated into your testimony, is that correct?
That's correct.
And since you provided a few changes last week, which were served and uploaded, I assume that you don't have any additional changes to share before you summarize your testimony, correct?
There are no additional changes. That's correct.
Mr. Burke, can you please summarize your testimony at this point?
Yes.
And Mr. Burke, if you could also speak up a little bit, I think it might help.
Oh, okay. Is this a little better? I'll adjust my volume on my microphone.
There you go.
Oh, okay, great. Good morning, Hearing Officer Kenzie and members of the board. I appreciate this opportunity to present my evaluation of the operation of the site's reservoir. My name is Tom Burke, and I have a master's degree in civil engineering with a specialty in water resources engineering. I have over 40 years of experience working on water resources projects across the country and have been working on water resource issues in the Delta for the past 15 years. Could you bring up SDWA 6A, please? My focus was primarily on the potential impacts to water availability and water quality in the South Delta. Our concern is that the impacts from the site project would aggravate the existing water quality issues and water flow issues that are presently affecting water availability in the South Delta. Next slide. In my analysis, I've reviewed the CalCim2 models that the site project team has developed for the project, as well as the DSM2 models covered in the no action alternative and the preferred action, which is listed as alternative 3. The models were developed by the site's team to evaluate the changes to water flow within the Delta resulting from the operation of the reservoir. CalCim2 and DSM2 are very different types of models. CalCim2 is a water supply and distribution planning model that evaluates the operation of the state and federal water projects within the supply and demands of the water users in the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers, as well as the Delta. The model operates on a monthly time step to try to balance the competing needs of the water users with the available water supply and regulatory requirements. In contrast, DSM2 is a true hydrodynamic model that uses the channel geometry of the individual channels and the physics of water movement to compute the flow and depth in the rivers in the Delta. The DSM2 model coverage extends from north end of the Delta at a point just south of Sacramento through the Delta down to Vernalis on the San Joaquin River. The DSM2 model runs on a 15-minute time step in contrast to the 30-day time step of the CalCim2 model. The 15-minute time step allows the model to evaluate the daily variations in the tidal cycle that can be impactful to water users within the Delta. Next slide, please. My evaluation of these models shows that the project will result in an increase in the volume of exports through the South Delta export pumps. I find this increase problematic due to the fact that the existing exports are already adversely affecting the water availability by decreasing water stage in the South Delta channels and by increasing sedimentation in the existing channels, which reduces their ability to convey water. In addition to those two issues associated with the increase in exports, I don't feel that the nearly 15-year-old version of the DSM2 model that's presently used by the site's team for their analysis can accurately assess the potential impacts of the project operations due to the old and outdated channel geometry that it is used in that version of the model. And lastly, the reservoir operations plan does not require water stored for the CVP and SWP projects to be used to necessarily meet the project's water obligations for their existing D1641 requirements and water rights. The primary driver for the identified impacts, as I mentioned earlier, is from the increase in CVP and SWP exports through the South Delta export pumps. We have not been able to evaluate the exact change in exports because the percentage of the site's reservoir for the CVP and SWP have not been finalized. But regardless of the final export quantity, any increase in exports will result in a continued lowering of the water level in the South Delta channels, exacerbating the existing problem. To some extent, the lowering of the water level in the channels is mitigated by the South Delta barriers that are installed in most years. But as I will show, the barriers are not very effective through much of the South Delta channels. Next slide. I would like to show an analysis that I conducted to evaluate the water level change at various locations in the South Delta that results from the exports that are presently being conducted at the CVP and SWP export pumps. Using the DSM-2 hydrodynamic model, I evaluated the change in water level with and without the exports at 3 locations. And as you can see on the map, I've identified each of the 3 locations where I've computed this difference. One is on Old River at Tracy, which is the leftmost red line that you see on the graph. I also looked at Sugar Cut, which is just south of that location, just downstream of the mouth of Tom Paine Slough. And I also evaluated another location on Middle River, just downstream of its confluence with Old River. Next slide, please. On this slide, I show 2 plots for Old River. I ran the DSM-2 model with and without the South Delta exports to see what the difference in stage would be. The graph in the lower right is a plot of the reduction in water stage for water year 1998 through water year 2010. This reduction shows the impact the exports have on water level at this location. As you can see, the water level is reduced across the full tidal cycle, sometimes as much as 2 feet. The graph in the upper left corner is a blow-up of the water level change in Old River in April 2001, with and without the South Delta exports. This highlights the difference that occurs in both the low and the high tide during the tidal cycle. The blue line represents the water level without exports, and the red line represents the water level resulting from the exports that are occurring during this period. It's important to note that the plots that we see here are produced from DSM-2, providing a water level on a 15-minute time step throughout the year. The calcium-2 model, which produces output on a monthly time step, would miss this type of water level response, which is an important aspect in the water users within the South Delta due to their ability to irrigate. Next slide, please. This slide shows the water level reduction with and without exports for the 2 other locations that we identified on the map. The lower right plot shows the reduction in stage in Sugar Cut resulting from the project South Delta exports. The upper left plot shows the reduction in stage in Middle River resulting from exports from the South Delta pumps for the Middle River section, just downstream from the confluence with Old River. As you can see, the amount of reduction in stage differs from each location. The further you get away from the export pumps, the less reduction in stage that you have. But yet you can still see that there is a significant reduction at both of these locations, going from 1 to almost 2 feet in reduction in water level, just due to the export pumps alone. Next slide. This is basically a summary of the lowered water level at the 3 locations that we just discussed. As you can see, we have a 2-foot reduction in stage on Old River, a 1.2 reduction in stage on Middle River, and a 1.75 stage reduction on Sugar Cut. The results from this are often an inability to irrigate because the diversion pumps can't get far enough down into the channel to get water. It also results in damage to the pumps, and which can ultimately result in a reduce of either a total crop or the crop yield for that particular year. Though the crops, when they need water at the time that the irrigation is required. They can't necessarily wait several days for the water level to come back up. And the reason why it's so important in regards to the site's reservoir project is that the project is proposing to increase the amount of exports from the South Delta pumps. We anticipate that this increase in exports will also have a corresponding decrease in the water level in the South Delta channels due to that export volume. Next slide. Another impact that we're really concerned about in the South Delta is sedimentation. The South Delta export pumps result in a reverse flow in the Middle River. This flow reduces the flushing of sediment out of the river during much of the year. The temporary barriers, which are intended to try to mitigate the lowering of the water level in the South Delta channels, results in a pooling of water behind the barrier, which also results in a lowering of the flow rate through the channel and allowing more sediment to fall out in the water column, further aggravating siltation in the channel. Together, both the barriers themselves, which are a mitigation for the export pumps, and the reverse flow, which reduces sediment flushing, result directly from the Delta exports, and those impacts will increase as Delta exports increase. Next slide. As an example of some of the siltation that we've been seeing, especially in Middle River, can be seen on these two photographs. The picture on the left is looking upstream of the Undine Bridge on Middle River. The picture on the right is looking downstream of the bridge. As can be seen in the downstream looking photo, the channel is nearly silted across its complete width. This event occurred during a low tide period, but a review of the Martinez tide gauge did not show an abnormally low tide on that date. Could we load SDWA 67, please? This will be a short video, which those two previous pictures were screen captures from that video. I think it's only about a minute long, but I think it's worth showing to see the complete picture of what the water level looked like below the bridge. I believe if you click on that picture, the video will play, hopefully.
Did we have to get, did you say SDWA 67?
That's correct.
Okay, I think we still have to bring it up.
Oh, okay. I tried sending over a PDF with the video embedded, but didn't quite work.
Yeah, there we go, I think.
Okay, great.
Should we go ahead and play? There we go.
Yeah, go ahead and play that. And as you can see, we're looking from upstream to downstream. Here's the downstream section that's nearly silted all the way across. Now we're panning back upstream again. This is at the pump station, and the video is being taken from the pump station platform. As you can see, the channel is just a small incised channel that cuts through the existing sediment deposit. Now, in that video, the flow was moving from right to left through the video. And from the shape of the vertical banks on the small cut channel, it looks to me like the river is completely silted in and was subsequently breached as the water pooled up on the upstream of the channel and then finally cut through the channel to flow downstream. The video was taken by Joey Ratto, who is a local farmer. He observed the flow condition and got out his video camera to take that video. I understand that he'll be testifying on November 4th. If we can go back to SDWA 68, please. Slide number 11. This is another way to look at the siltation that's occurring in Middle River. This is a bathymetric map of the channel. It's actually two bathymetric maps subtracted from each other. But a bathymetric map is a type of topographic map of the channel bottom. The data that we've used to evaluate the channel bottom was collected by boat using a multi-beam transducer, which measures multiple depths from a single transducer array at a very high resolution. The resulting data provides a highly accurate 3D picture of the channel bottom. If you have two of these surveys collected at different times, you can actually subtract one survey from the other to see the change in the channel bottom that's occurred between those two dates. And what we have here is a difference map that's showing the difference between the 2024 bathymetric survey and the 2017 bathymetric survey. And the way this is portrayed is the change in elevation of the channel bottom corresponds to different colors. In this particular map, red corresponds to an increase in channel siltation by 2 to 3 feet. The orange represents 1 to 2 feet of siltation. Yellow is between 0 and 1 foot of siltation. and the green, blue, and pink represent actual scour areas that have occurred within the channel. Now, as you can see from this figure, we have a fairly large area upstream of the bridge that has up to 3 feet of sediment that is deposited around the channel. Now, this is a sediment plug that's not necessarily a fixed element. The deposition and erosional process is not stationary and can move through the channel from year to year. These are the deposition moves to different locations in the channel, like waves of sediment moving through the system. But as we've noted from the different surveys that we've had over the years, the net deposition over the channel length has been steadily increasing from year to year. This type of deposition in a channel is particularly problematic. In a riverine system, the water level upstream of the plug would build up and eventually overtop the plug and continue downstream. But in a network of connected channels like we have in the Delta, the flow that has been going through Middle River in response to the increase in resistance of the reach that is silted in will redistribute itself to other channels, resulting in a reduction of flow in Middle River and an increase in other flows that lead towards the outlet of the Delta or whatever the downstream gradient is drawing those flows to. Next slide, please. Continuing on through Middle River, we would like to be able to highlight some of the differences that we see in Middle River between reality and what the DSM-2 model is capable of, or what the DSM-2 model is composed of. Like we'd mentioned earlier, the DSM-2 model consists of bathymetry that's been collected over the years. Some of it can be significantly old. And what we have here is a plot. We've got elevation on the y-axis and distance downstream on Middle River on the x-axis. On the left-hand side, we have the confluence of Middle River with Old River. And at the right-hand side, we have the downstream end where Middle River discharges into Victoria Canal. The black line represents the survey that was conducted in 2023, actually between 2022 and 2023. And it shows you what the elevation, the channel bottom is today. The red line represents how DSM-2 portrays Middle River. And as you can see, the DSM-2 red line of the invert or the channel bottom for Middle River is much lower than the actual surveyed elevation in the channel. What this does is it provides you an increase in conveyance area and an unrealistically estimate of what the flow area and volume of water in the channel is going to be. And what we have here, actually, this red line was plotted up using the latest version of DSM-2, which is 8.2.1, or the latest version that's presently being distributed by DWR on their website. But the version of DSM-2 that was used by the sites team for the analysis of the site's reservoir is version 8.0.6. That version is about 15 years old and consists of geometry that was collected in the 10 to 20 year period prior to that release. So what we have in that particular model is extremely old geometry. And the bathymetry for that particular model shows about an extra 2 feet deep channel in Middle River, even beyond what the red line is showing us here for the most recent version of DSM-2. And so the deeper your channel goes, the more you deviate from reality, the larger your flow areas and the lower reliability of what the actual flow in the channel is and the stage. And this becomes very problematic when you're trying to use DSM-2 to evaluate channel impacts when the DSM-2 model itself cannot evaluate what the proper flow and stage is in the channel. Also, as you can see here, the zero line is a kind of an indicated line in the delta channels to show where we start to see flow stage problems. If your channel starts to get much beyond zero, you're going to start having depth issues. Now, the red line, which is what DSM-2 shows for the channel, you see you have a lot of flow area. But when you look at the black line, the actual most recent bathymetric survey, you're decreasing that availability and you're getting shallower and shallower in the channel. Next slide, please. Here is a cross section that we've taken on Middle River, just downstream of the confluence of Middle River with Old River. What we've done here is we've plotted up a cross section, which is a slice through the channel, showing what the channel would look like if you were to actually cut it with a knife and look at it in the downstream direction. We've plotted up two cross sections on this plot. We've got the dark black line, which represents the most recent topography and bathymetry collected in the channel in the 22-23 survey. And then in the red line, we have the cross section as represented in the DSM-2 model. And what we did is we ran the DSM-2 model for the November 2023 period to see what the water surface elevation and flow area would look like. And for that, in the DSM-2 model, we have that blue and white hatched surface. That gives you the flow area that DSM-2 model thinks it has. Now, based on observations at the site, we estimated what the depth would be, and we applied that depth to the actual cross-section, which is the black line. And that dark blue section is the actual flow area that we were seeing on that day. And as you can see, that flow area and the crosshatched blue area are very different. It's not even the same channel. So we makes the DSM-2 model ability to predict what water levels would be and its response to flow quite unpredictable and unreliable. And as you can see, the water level itself is about 1.5 feet down from what DSM-2 says it has to what the channel really has. So instead of 6 feet of water, we get 6 or 9 inches of water in the channel.
Mr. Burke, I'm sorry to interrupt. Just to pause for a moment. It looks like our court reporter, Ms. Medina, has a question, probably about a word. Ms. Medina, please go ahead.
I'm sorry. No, it's just, I'm sorry. It's been nearly 2 hours. I'm getting quite fatigued. I would appreciate if we could break soon, just for the accuracy of the record.
That sounds fine. I guess I've looked to Mr. Burke. I assume we're moving along quite quickly. How much longer do you think you have for?
I probably have another 15 to 20 minutes, depending on how fast I speak. But
well, don't go faster.
Yeah, I was wondering if I was going too fast because I can slow down.
So let's go ahead, Ms. Medina, I appreciate, let's go ahead and I'm sorry to do this, Mr. Burke, but if you don't mind, we'll go ahead and take a 10-minute break.
Oh, that's fine.
And then we'll come back at, let's do it 12 minutes. We'll make it a round number and come back at 3:15 and we'll pick up. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, it's 3:15. I'll look to Ms. Medina. Are you ready for us to go back on the record?
I am. Thank you so much.
Thank you. With that, thank you, Mr. Burke, for breaking in the middle of your presentation. I appreciate that.
No problem.
And we will, I'm not sure, you may need to remind us which slide we were on. Or
Number
maybe
13.
Ms. Mullen may already know, but I don't remember. There we go.
Yeah, that's the one.
All right, and
I have a
whenever you're
question
ready.
for Ms. Am I speaking too quickly? Should I slow down? Should I keep up with me?
That would be great if you could slow down a bit. Thank you.
Okay, sure.
Thank you. And please go ahead when you're ready.
Okay. We were discussing the comparison of the actual bathymetry on Middle River downstream of the confluence with Old River versus what the modeled section of that river is within the DSM-2 model. And on this plot, we had the red cross section, which represents what the model sees as the channel geometry on Middle River downstream of Old River. And we have solid black line, which is the actual geometry that exists downstream of the river, downstream of the confluence with Old River. And as you can see, the geometry is quite different between these two cross sections. One is narrow and deep, and the other one is wide and shallow. And we ran the DSM-2 model for the November 20th, 2023 period to examine what the water surface elevation and flow area would be in the DSM-2 model versus what was actually observed at the site when we went down to see the channel cross section and what's shown in the video that we just previously saw. And as you can see here in the plot, the hashed blue lines represent the flow area that DSM-2 thinks exists at this location. And the solid blue fill area is the flow area that actually existed on that morning. So there's quite a big discrepancy between what is actually happening in Middle River in this reach versus what the DSM-2 model thinks is happening in this reach. Next slide. Another concern that we have and is related to the sedimentation problem that we're seeing in Middle River is the change in flow pattern. And Greg had touched upon this earlier in his presentation, in that after they started doing South Delta exports, it changed the dynamics of the South Delta flow characteristics and changed the direction of flow in many of the channels. And what I show here is two different arrows next to the main channels and main rivers that are near the export pumps. And the blue line represents the flow direction without exports, or the blue arrow represents the flow direction without exports, and the red arrow represents the flow direction with exports. And as you can see, in 3 of the channels, the flow direction has actually changed. And that change has a dramatic effect on the sedimentation characteristics and the flushing flow characteristics of those channels. The change in the dominant flow direction can have a significant effect on the sediment dynamics with potential impacts of sedimentation, scour, or the movement of sediment from one river to the next. It's important to reiterate that the site's project itself is not creating these dramatic effects, but the project results in an increase in South Delta exports from the storage partners. Next slide, please. This is just a table of the locations that we just previously highlighted on the map, showing the direction of flow. This shows you what's happening, or tabulates what's happening in Old River, Middle River, Grant Line, and Victoria. As you can see in Old River, Low Clifton Court, Forebay, we used to have a 2,500 acre-foot per day flow moving in the downstream direction. Now the average flow is 6,400 feet in the upstream direction. Middle River changed direction also. Used to have an average of 1,900 acre-feet per day in the downstream direction, and Middle River now has 4,951 average acre-feet per day in the upstream direction. And as you can see from these 3 locations, Old River, Middle River, and Victoria Canal, they've had their flows change significantly to the point of actually changing the direction. This change in flow direction, changes the sediment dynamics of the system, and in the case of Middle River, has resulted in significant sedimentation buildup. Next slide, please. Summarize what we've just looked at, the change in circulation patterns in the South Delta and the temporary barriers that have been installed to try to mitigate that have had dramatic effects on the sediment movement from the system. The ability to flush sediment out of the system has been reduced, resulting in a buildup of sediment that has been documented on Middle River. The buildup of sediment not only affects the water depth in the channel, but the conveyance capacity of the channel, resulting in a redistribution of flows to the channels around the silted in areas. This distribution of flow and the reduction in flushing flow may be one of the contributing factors resulting in the salt buildup in Old River Channel near Tracy as well. Next slide. One of the things I've touched on in some of the other charts that we've looked at so far is the ability to accurately model the flow impacts due to the increased exports that we're seeing from the sites project. The version that came out in 2010, which is the version of DSM-2 came out in 2010 that the sites project is using, is based on extremely old bathymetry that in many cases does not come close to even reflecting what we see today in the channel. Version 8.06, which is used by the project, was released in 2010, is now going on 15 years old. It is not the analytical procedures of the model that I have a problem with, but rather the channel data that's used in the model. The channel bathymetry that is used in the version of the model, even though it was released in 2010, was collected in 2010. The bathymetry consists of a variety of surveys that are collected over the 10 to 20 years prior to the model being released. So the channel geometry used in the model may be as much as 20 to 30 years old. So the 2017 to 2024 bathymetry map that we showed previously may only be a small representation of the changes that have occurred to the channel system in that 30-year period. If you have the wrong bathymetry, you're going to get the wrong depth from your model. The wrong depth will give you the wrong flow. The wrong flow will give you an inability to correct the true impacts from the system. Next slide, please. Another one of the impacts from the reduction in water surface elevation through the delta as a result of the exports is its impact on flow into Tom Plain Slough. The slough is a major irrigation source for the Pescadero irrigation district. The flow into the slough comes through the Tom Plain Slough control structure. And you can see this control structure on the map that's up on this slide. The control structure consists of two 4x5 box culverts and four 36-inch diameter siphons. Now the water goes from Sugarcut into Tom Plain Slough in one direction. The water comes into Tom Plain Slough on a high tide and then is prevented from leaving Tom Plain Slough through a series of flap gates that are put on the siphons as well as the concrete box culverts. As the water level in the South Delta decreases, which is Sugarcut side of this structure, the amount of flow that can enter Tom Plain Slough is reduced. And over the years, that water level has been reducing gradually to the point now where they're having periods of time where they can only meet half of their irrigation requirements. Next slide, please. This figure is a plot of the reduction of water entering Tom Plain Slough as a function of South Delta exports. The vertical axis on the plot is the annual volume of water entering Tom Plain Slough. The x-axis represents the volume of exports going from a no export condition on the left side of the graph to 100% export condition on the right side of the graph. And as you can see, as exports increase, the amount of water that's able to flow into Tom Plain Slough decreases significantly, going from nearly 50,000 acre-feet per year with no exports down to around 10,000 acre-feet per year with the present rate of exports that we have in the Delta. As the export volume is increased, we're going to see a subsequent reduction in water level within the Delta, and this ability to move water into Tom Plain Slough is going to be further reduced over what it already has been with the existing exports. Next slide, please. And finally, one of the concerns that we have is the ability to meet regulatory requirements. Although the sites project itself is obligated to meet existing and future water quality objectives, the storage partners / owners, their water that they have within the site's reservoir is not obligated to meet the water quality objectives connected to those partners' existing water rights. And we think that any new water that will be stored by an existing storage partner should first be applied to meeting their existing water quality requirements for their existing permits with the water that they store before they're allowed to distribute this for additional water supply. Next slide. And one of the things that we've been looking at that concerns us in terms of being able to use the available water, the new water that's going to be stored in site's reservoir to meet existing regulatory requirements is the problem that they've had meeting the D1641 requirements at Old River at Tracy. The requirements are exceeded consistently from year to year, and I think Greg showed a plot of how often those requirements are exceeded with his graph that had those yellow sections showing what can happen when they're not meeting these requirements or how often it can happen. What we've looked at is relating the water quality or the water quality conditions at Old River at Tracy and the ability to meet the D1641 requirements to the amount of water that is presently being discharged at Vernalis. And this plot here is showing the salinity over time at Old River at Tracy. The y-axis is the salinity in microsiemens per centimeter, and the x-axis is the time over the year for water year 2020, or 2021 rather. This is a location where the project frequently doesn't meet the D1641 requirements, but as you can see in the plot, if you look at the red line, which represents the flow at Vernalis, and the blue line, which represents the salinity at Old River at Tracy, you can see whenever you have an increase in flow at Vernalis, you can sometimes have a significant decrease in the salinity level at Old River at Tracy. Especially in the late summer here, if you look at June, a small increase in the discharge and at Vernalis resulted in a very large decrease in the salinity at Old River. And then as soon as that discharge at Vernalis went down, the salinity level went up to, nearly about 1,200 or 1,300 at the end of the year. That small increase in Vernalis resulted in a huge change in the salinity level at Old River at Tracy. We think that water that can be stored in the site's reservoir might be used to help meet this requirement that the projects repeatedly have been saying is impossible to meet. And we don't think that's necessarily impossible to meet this requirement if they look at increasing the flow in Vernalis. Next slide, please. The question is how to get flows over into Vernalis. Now, there's ways we can use water from the export pumps to cross over the valley to get to the San Joaquin River. You can use the Newman and Wesley waterways, which are shown as red on this plot, to convey water from the Delta Mendota Canal over to the San Joaquin River. This can be used to directly export exports from the South Delta into the San Joaquin, or you could use tributary reservoirs to help increase the flow that you have at Vernalis, or you can take flow out of San Luis Reservoir, move it across these two wasteways or another pathway, and increase the flow at Vernalis. The question is that none of these alternatives have ever been evaluated by Sites Reservoir or by the Sites team, and we think that it's important for them to analyze this condition to determine when it would be helpful and under what conditions that they can move this water to increase the ability to meet their regulatory obligations for the D1641 compliance point at Old River at Tracy. Next slide. This is a plot of the relationship between salinity at Old River and the flow at Vernalis. We wanted to take a look at the long-term relationship of how did salinity at Old River Tracy changed with changing water in Vernalis, not only during that 1 year that we looked at in detail previously, but over a longer period of time. And we plotted up the relationship between salinity at Old River Tracy and the flow within Vernalis. And we found a relationship that exists there. Now we're just looking at July, August, and September in this plot. So that's kind of a coarse view of what's happening. And we're not looking at any particular type of water year, but all water years put together. We think that it's very, very important for the sites team to go ahead and look at the ability to be able to improve the water quality at Old River Tracy and analyze when that would be able to occur, given the water available within the site's reservoir, or if the projects would like to contribute water from other areas to meet their present obligations. Next slide, please. And in summary, the site's reservoir project, by increasing exports through the South Delta pumps, will have a corresponding increase in the existing impacts, which include reduction in stage, sedimentation, and water quality. Releases from the site's reservoir and or rediversion of exports to the San Joaquin River should be evaluated to facilitate meeting the existing project's unmet regulatory obligations at Old River Tracy before the water is released for other diversions. And that concludes the summary of my testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Burke. With that, I think I will look to the team. I believe we need to bring up Mr. Burke and Mr. Wilson. That's really on your end. There we go. And I will look to Mr. Hitchings. Are you the appropriate person to start with to ask if you have questions for this panel? Or Mr. Ferguson? Or Ms. Chester? Finally got it right. Thank you. Ms. Chester, please go ahead if you have questions.
Before I begin, I did want to note a couple of objections on the record regarding Mr. Burke's presentation. Specifically, slide 16 included discussion outside of the scope of his written testimony, specifically regarding the impacts related to temporary barriers, as well as slide 22, which included a discussion of sites' failure to analyze potential cross-basin transfer pathways. And for clarification, I am going to focus my question specifically to Mr. Burke.
All right, thank you, Ms. Chester.
Thank you. Mr. Burke, my name is Michelle Chester. I am an attorney on behalf of the Sites Project Authority. I do appreciate you being here today.
Thank you. I'm glad I can help.
Can we please bring up his testimony, SDWA 2A? Thank you. Can we please go to page 4 at line 9? Mr. Burke, in paragraph 6, you state that the CVP and the SWP will both acquire additional water from the volume of water that will be stored in site's reservoir, correct?
That's correct.
Is DWR a participant of the site's reservoir project?
I don't know if DWR is a participant specifically, but I know the SWP as a project will have a volume of water that will be part of the site's reservoir storage volume.
If I told you it's not correct that SWP will acquire water from the site's reservoir, would that be new information to you?
That would be clarification to what I understand presently. That's true.
Does that change any of the conclusions in your analysis?
No, not at all.
Your analysis includes consideration of both exports related to CVP and SWP, correct?
I include them both as export components. That's true, but my analysis was on purely exports, regardless of who it may be applied to.
we please scroll down to see lines 18 to 23 on this page? Mr. Burke, in paragraph 7, you relied on data from the California Data Exchange Center to state that the average pumping rate for the Banks and Tracy pumping plants, correct?
That's correct.
You don't state the period of time you use to calculate those average rates, do you?
No, it's not stated there.
And you conclude that the average pumping rates impact the natural flow pattern, correct?
In the South Delta, that's correct.
And you're describing alleged existing conditions, correct?
That's correct.
You don't cite any documentation in the administrative record regarding these impacts, do you?
I'm not sure exactly what you mean by administrative record.
Was anything submitted to the administrative hearing office that supports that conclusion?
My testimony does.
And, okay. In paragraph 8, if we can please scroll to page 5. Thank you. In paragraph 8, you state that the calcium 2 model showed a combined increase of roughly 95,700 acre feet per year for the alt-3 scenario. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And that 95,700 acre feet represents exports to sites participants, correct?
No, that 95,700 was a component of the calcium 2 model that was directed towards exports.
So it's State Water Project and Central Valley Project exports?
That's correct.
And so that supports your conclusion in line 2 here, that you conclude that alt-3 scenario resulted in an increase in exports for both CVP and SWP. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Again, because the SWP wouldn't acquire water from the sites project, does that change any of your analysis or conclusions here?
No, because my analysis was primarily to document the existing impacts from exports in general, regardless of who is acquiring that export. And that what we wanted to say was, given that the fact that existing exports are having an impact on the delta condition, any increase, whether it goes to SWP, CVP, or what have you, will result in an aggravation of those impacts, and those impacts will be increased.
But you conclude in this paragraph that that 95,700 is a relatively small increase, correct?
I don't think I state whether that is all that small or not, but it doesn't really matter whether it's a small increase or a large increase. Any increase to an existing degraded condition will further degrade that condition.
Did you calculate how small an increase it was compared to existing total exports?
I think I looked at a percentage. I know that the sites project team is still in the process of evaluating how much each of the different components or storage users are going to get. And I know that presently, I believe that they're evaluating somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 as an increase in exports. But at 100,000, which is the lower end of their estimate, which is what they must have included in the calcium 2 model, on an annual average, it's fairly small. It's only about 2%. But if you look at a monthly change, there's some months there are actually a 10,000% increase in flow and exports. And on other months, there's actually a 5,000 a month % decrease in flow. So what you have is a wide variety of changes that's all over the map. And looking at an average annual that exports over the period that the calcium 2 model was run in, you're not going to get a very accurate representation of what those impacts can be, because averaging this over an annual or mean annual period is going to wash out any of the impacts that would result in a weekly, daily, or monthly period.
You don't cite any documentation here from the administrative record regarding those alleged impacts, do you?
I'm not sure exactly what you mean.
Again, the only place this information is contained is your written testimony, is that correct?
We're going to subject is vague, and I'm not sure what she's referring to.
I'm asking the witness if he submitted or is aware of any supporting documentation submitted to the administrative record that supports his conclusion in lines 5 to 6 in this paragraph.
Other than his testimony?
Correct.
But I guess supporting evidence or documentation that would be with that would be the actual calcium 2 model that the site's team has developed themselves. I don't know whether that model has been entered into the record or they're just providing that to people for people to evaluate. But I used their model and used their data. We didn't make any changes. We didn't add anything. We just looked at what they had put in their own model.
Can we please scroll down on this page to see lines 8 through 23, paragraph 9? Thank you.
Okay.
So in paragraph 9, you ran 2 scenarios in the DSM-2 model, one with existing South Delta exports and one with the existing exports removed. Is that correct?
One without South Delta exports and one with the existing South Delta exports included.
Correct. In this paragraph, you didn't compare the existing South Delta exports to exports with the sites project, did you?
No, since we didn't know what the actual exports are going to be, they're still evaluating that. We wouldn't really come up with any kind of numbers that would make sense since it's a condition that's changing constantly.
Did you have a range available at the time you performed your analysis?
At that time, I understood it to be somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000, depending on the component of the reservoir that the Bureau of Reclamation decided they wanted to buy into.
Wouldn't that information be relevant to considering any change in exports due to the sites project?
We're in the process of evaluating more detail of what that means on a monthly or weekly basis. But I thought what was important, and I still think is most important now, is that there isn't a degraded condition that's causing adverse effects to the existing agricultural users in the South Delta under the existing condition without any increase in discharges from or an increase in exports as a result of the site's reservoir project. So any increase in those exports from the site's reservoir project, no matter how small, is going to increase the adverse impacts that we're presently experiencing due to exports themselves.
And I think you just said it, but it's correct that the relative increase in exports from the sites project is expected to be significantly smaller than the difference between existing South Delta exports and no exports, correct?
Without knowing the exact number, I couldn't say for sure, but whether it's large or small isn't going to change the fact that it's going to make things worse in the Delta. And that's a really good question, because what that falls back on is how the different impacts to the Delta for this project as well as other projects are perceived. Every project that's been going on in the Delta for the last, 10 or 20 years, each project only increases the impact to the Delta a small amount,
Mr. Burke,
or just a small amount.
I apologize for interrupting you, but I do want to stay focused on the analysis you performed for the sites project.
Okay.
So I'm going to move to another question. Did your analysis of the 2 scenarios include consideration of water quality differences?
No, we were primarily looking at stage and flow at this time. We're still in the process of evaluating what those water quality conditions may change, depending on how the site's team finally results in the ultimate discharge that they're going to have for the South Delta exports.
Is it possible that the water quality would be better in the South Delta under the scenario with exports?
Without evaluating it, I would say anything is possible, but I wouldn't think that's very likely to happen.
Wouldn't an influx of Sacramento River water into the South Delta channels provide better quality water than San Joaquin water and agricultural runoff?
You would think that, but that's not what we've been seeing in the existing analyses from previous projects, because the majority of that good water that is coming down through Sacramento is being drawn into the export pumps.
In the analysis in paragraph 9 and the associated figures 1 through 5. Actually, I'm going to move on. Can we please go to page 9, to paragraph 10? Thank you. In this paragraph, you conclude that the increase in Delta exports that will occur with the sites project will increase the reduction in water level that the South and Central Delta are already experiencing. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Can we please go back up to page 4 at line 11? In paragraph 6, you state, under existing conditions, the CVP and SWP South Delta exports are impacting the water availability for water right holders who rely on water being available in the Delta channels. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Is this the basis for your conclusion, or is the basis for your conclusion in paragraph 6 stated in paragraph 10?
I need to take a look at paragraph 10. I think they're complementary. I don't know if I would recall it the basis of my statement there, but paragraph 10 talks about some of the impacts that are felt by water users in the Delta due to that reduction in stage.
So when you refer to water availability in paragraph 6, are you referring to the ability to access water in the channel due to a change in water level?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. Can we please go back to page 9, paragraph 10? You say in this paragraph that 1/10 of a foot difference in water level can make the difference between being able to divert water from the channel and not being able to divert, correct?
That's correct.
You didn't consider expected daily fluctuations in water level at any particular location, did you?
No, I didn't actually look at any particular location and the daily variation that we see. It's just the reduction in what that peak flow might be or the peak stage might be under the high or low tide conditions.
And again, I think you've confirmed this, but you didn't calculate the amount that Sites Reservoir would allegedly reduce water levels in the South and Central Delta compared to existing conditions, correct?
No, we didn't. Without having the exact numbers that they're going to export, we couldn't perform that evaluation.
Would you agree that both the reduction in water level and whether the reduction would affect water available to specific irrigators is relevant to your conclusion that sites exports are impacting availability?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that, please?
Sure. Would you agree that both the reduction in water level and whether reduction would affect water available to irrigators are both relevant to your conclusion that sites exports are impacting availability?
Yes, I think the two components that you started out with are the impacts that are felt by the reduction in water level within the channel.
So looking at the last sentence in paragraph 10, you don't cite any documentation in the administrative record that supports your conclusion that 1/10 of a foot difference in water level will make a difference to any specific diverter as a result of the sites project, correct?
That's correct. My
Can we
primary information on that came from talking to farmers that irrigate in that area where their present irrigation conditions, they're so close to the water surface that even a 1/10 of a foot drawdown can impact their ability to draw water through a full tidal cycle.
And you didn't submit that information in your written testimony, did you?
No, I did not.
Can we please go to page 10, paragraph 12? In this paragraph, you describe existing conditions in the delta based on current exports. Is that correct?
That's correct.
In the last sentence of paragraph 12, you reference table 1, and table 1 shows a change in mean daily flow, correct?
That's correct.
Can we please scroll to look at table 1? The third column from the left is titled with exports, correct?
That's correct.
Does that column contain data about existing South Delta exports?
It contains the flow rate in the channel when they're under the existing condition with Delta exports.
So table 1 does not consider the change in mean daily flow of South Delta exports with the sites project, does it?
So the sites project, since they don't have an export volume yet, was not evaluated.
And can we please go down to paragraph 13 on this page?
I don't have a paragraph 13.
You specifically look at the change in flow experienced by the Middle River using data from table 1 in this paragraph, correct?
That's correct.
And you conclude that the increased exports that are expected with the sites project will only further decrease flushing of Middle River and increase the amount of sedimentation, correct?
That's correct.
Table 1 doesn't contain any data or analysis about increased exports expected with the sites project, does it?
No, I base that on the fact that any increase in exports from the sites project or any place else is going to have an increase in the impact that we're seeing, and I'm trying to describe with this table.
So in your opinion, to reach your conclusions in paragraph 13, you didn't need to analyze the relative change in exports due to the sites project compared to existing South Delta exports?
I think it'd be interesting to be able to evaluate that once that data is available. But what we wanted to do, since that data wasn't available, was to evaluate whether any increase in impact in discharge or exports would affect the South Delta. And our experience, based on the results that we see under the existing exports, is that any increase will have that impact.
And you referred to your experience. Is that information contained in your written testimony or elsewhere in the administrative record?
No, I didn't describe my experience over the last 15 years in the administrative record.
Can we please go to page 12 at line 24, 25? Beginning in paragraph 14, you discuss an example of sedimentation at Undine Bridge on November 20th, 2023, correct?
That's correct.
And you provided the photographs from that date in figure 8 on page 14, as well as the video link on page 13, correct?
That's correct.
And I believe you confirmed in your summary that you did not take the video, correct?
That's correct.
Were you at this location of the video on November 20th, 2023?
And no, I wasn't.
Have you been to this location?
Many times, yes.
Why did you or Mr. Ratto choose November 20th of 2023 as the example you're using in your written testimony?
I'm not sure why Mr. Ratto was at the site, but I believe he was trying to irrigate on that day and his pumps went dry and he was examining what the problem was. But you would have to check with him to see exactly why he was there.
You acknowledge that the photographs and video were taken during low tide conditions, correct?
That's correct.
What is the purpose of Mr. Ratto's diversion at that location?
I would assume it's for irrigating his crops.
we please go to page 14, figure 9? In figure 9, you're showing the relative change in sedimentation of the Middle River upstream and downstream of Undine Bridge based on a comparison of bathymetric surveys conducted in 2017 and 2024, correct?
That's correct.
And you reference a 2022 bathymetry or bathymetric survey in the list of materials you reviewed for this analysis back in paragraph 4 at the outset of your testimony. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Is this 2024 survey different?
It is. It's an additional survey that we conducted in 2024 after we noticed the problem at Undine Bridge.
You also reference a 2023 bathymetry in figure 10. Is that also different than the 2022 survey?
No, the 2022/2023 survey was a single survey, but it took over a year to complete. Some of the data was collected in 2022. Some of the data was collected in 2023, but it was finalized by, I think, the middle or the fall of 2023.
Why did you choose to rely on the 2022-2023 survey data if you have more recent information?
The 2022-2023 survey covered a larger data set. It covered the whole delta, so it allowed us to see what was happening not only in Middle River, but in Old River as well.
And can we please scroll to page 15, paragraph 15? You state that figure 9 shows areas of the channel that have filled in more than 3 feet. Is that correct?
I have to read that.
I'm looking at lines 4 to 5.
Yeah, that should actually be between 2 and 3 feet. Up to 3 feet of depth.
And that conclusion is based on the red shading in figure 9, is that correct?
That's correct.
The red and orange shading in figure 9 is concentrated near the bridge, correct?
That's correct.
Is there a reason sediment is being deposited only at that location of the bridge?
I think it's just happens to be that the sediment was moving through that section at that time. We've noticed in other surveys that the sediment wedge that we see there sometimes is further upstream or further downstream. It's not a constant wedge at that point. Although when we've looked at the different surveys from year to year, we see a gradual increase in the amount of sediment over the whole channel, but some of the worst conditions of sediment move from location to location with each of the different surveys.
Based on the video and the photographs, are you aware of any structure blocking flow at the Undine Bridge location?
There are several piers for the bridge, for the Undine Bridge, and there's also a structure for the pump and associated machinery necessary for the diversion at that location. But I don't believe any of those provide a big enough blockage to flow to cause a buildup of water and a deposit of sediment at that location. The channel is quite wide, and the blockage area of the piers and the pump station are not a significant portion of the channel.
What do you mean by significant portion?
They're not blocking a significant portion of the channel.
Just to understand that further, you're saying the bridge structure, the pier structure, is not significant compared to the width of the channel at that location. Is that correct?
That's correct. The piers are rather narrow and elongated and in the direction of flow. I wouldn't imagine, I'd expect to see more scour at the nose of the pier than I would blockage and deposition in front of the piers.
In this paragraph 15, you also say that over the full length of Middle River, over 44,000 cubic yards of silt have filled in the channel during a 7-year period. Is that correct?
And what paragraph are you looking at?
15?
That's correct.
And is that 7-year period correct? That's based on the 2022, 2023 data?
I believe that was on the 2024, 2017 data.
What is the full length of the Middle River?
I think it's around 70,000 feet, something like that.
Does an average of the total amount of silt added to the channel in a 7-year period inform the reader about any particular areas of sedimentation?
No, that was just calculated as a net change between the surface that existed in 2017 and the surface that existed in 2024. It's a net change for the channel, not respective of any particular area.
Does that average inform the reader about whether any particular year showed more sedimentation than another?
No, it was just showing the difference of the accumulated sediment between those two periods.
And did you include your calculation or any supporting data for your conclusion that 44,000 cubic yards of silt have filled in the channel during a 7-year period?
No, I don't believe we included the calculations for that.
Can we please scroll back up to figure 9? Would you agree that the majority of the channel is shaded in green and blue?
That's true. I agree.
Isn't it correct that figure 9 shows localized sedimentation under Undine Bridge?
It does.
And for figures 10 and 11 and the associated discussion, why did you focus your analysis of DSM-2 model results at this single location showing localized sedimentation?
Because we wanted to see what the difference is between the existing DSM-2 model and its ability to reflect the actual geometry and what the true geometry was at that location. And it's not just this location. In further plots that we have that you'll probably get to, it shows that the DSM-2 model has consistent problems in modeling the channel bottom within the Middle River.
May we please go to page 15, line 27? In paragraph 16, you state that figure 10 shows the 2022 joint SDWA-DWR bathymetric survey data compared to DSM-2 model, correct?
Which lines are you reading?
Line 27. Oh, excuse me, that's off. I'm looking at paragraph 16. Could we scroll up just for a second so I can see the number? Thank you. Yeah, so this is the paragraph. You're talking about figure 10 showing the 2022. It's right at the bottom, actually. I had it correct if you can scroll down. The second to last sentence. You're discussing what's included in figure 10, correct?
That's correct.
And can we please scroll to figure 10 on page 16? The title says it's the 2024 bathymetric survey compared to DSM-2, correct?
That's correct.
The legend in figure 10 says 2023 bathymetry, correct?
Yeah, I believe that the title is probably incorrect. The title should be the 2022-2023 bathymetric set.
What's the time step reflected in figure 10?
It's not really a time step model. It's just a physical plot. So I would imagine you're talking about the distance, how often points are selected. I think for the 2022 survey that's being plotted up in the black line, I believe that we got a point about once every 100 feet or so, although I don't know the exact distance between points. And then for the DSM-2 model, we took the first cross-section for each of the model segments that are included in the DSM-2 model.
Is this all for November 20th, 2023?
No, this is independent of November completely. This is just showing the ability, or it was showing what is represented in the DSM-2 model versus what the survey shows as the channel bottom. It's not related to the November 2023 period at all.
So figure 10 shows the DSM-2 bathymetry of about -1 feet for Middle River at Undine Bridge. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Can we please scroll to page 17, figure 11? Figure 11 shows the DSM-2 bathymetry of over 2 feet for the Middle River at Undine Bridge. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Can you explain why the data used in figures 10 and 11 are different?
It looks like the cross-section that was selected in figure 11 for a comparison to what was actually happening was a cross-section that isn't represented in figure 10. It's actually deeper than what's showing in figure 10, which shows a greater deviation from what the actual geometry is at that location. Like I said, when I described the data that was used in development of figure 10, we took the first cross-section that was included with each channel reach within the DSM-2 model. And the DSM-2 model separates channel segments that traverse a length of river. And each of those segments can contain 1, 2, or more cross-sections within that segment. What we did for this plot was to take the first cross-section within each channel segment. And I believe it was channel segment 125 through channel segment 131.
Did you use the same survey data in figure 11 as you did in figure 10?
I did.
On page 17, in paragraph 17, thank you. You say that any model runs using DSM-2 channel geometry will show flow rates in the Middle River considerable higher than are actually occurring, correct?
That's correct.
Did you provide any quantitative data that supports that claim?
No, we didn't actually calculate what the flow would be in the river. We're just going basically by the fact that it has, from just a visual inspection, 5 to 10 times more flow area than what we actually observed in the channel.
Can we please jump to page 20? And at lines 18 to 19, please. In paragraph 22, you discuss your evaluation of scenarios representing a 25, 50, and 75% reduction in exports, correct?
That's correct.
And you're referring to the analysis presented in figure 15, correct?
That's correct.
What version of DSM-2 did you use for this analysis?
That would be version 8.2.1.
Is that the same version as used by the site's witnesses?
No, they used a version that's about 10 years older than that. They used 8.0.6.
What time period is reflected in figure 15?
This actually is independent of any time period. This is purely a structure rating curve for the structure that allows water into Tom Paine Slough. It looks at just the relationship between water level on both sides of the structure and what that water level will do in terms of driving water through the structure.
So figure 15 doesn't take into consideration any information about timing or variation in magnitude of exports, does it?
No, it's unrelated to exports. It's just showing the relationship between flow level in the channel in Sugar Cut to the amount of flow that can go through the channel as a function of the amount of exports that is occurring. So in that regards, yes, you're probably right. It takes into account exports into that analysis, but the exports drive water level, the water level drives flow into Tompane Slough. So what we're plotting up here is a change in flow based on the change in water level that would result from each of these different percent levels of exports.
What did you assume as the present export rate?
The present export rate would be that export rate that is listed in the historical channel study that distributed by DWR for the DSM-2 model.
In paragraph 22, you state that DWR periodically sets up pumps at the control structure to accommodate the reduction in flow due to exports, correct?
That's correct.
And you state that additional pump assistance would be required to maintain the necessary inflow at the slough, correct?
That's correct.
Do you provide any data supporting that conclusion?
I know that with the pumps that they provided in the past, they were just barely able to keep up with the demand for irrigation water in Tompane Slough. If they increase the amount of exports, they'll draw the groundwater, or they'll draw the surface water down more. They'll have less water flowing into Tompane Slough, and they're going to need additional pumps in order to compensate for that.
And did you include any information about your observations over one or more water year about the ability to keep up with pumping assistance?
No, I haven't. It's based on anecdotal data that I had in conversations with the irrigation master for the Pescadero Irrigation District.
Can we please go to page 22? In paragraph 24, you state that the D1641 salinity level requirement is consistently not met at Old River at Tracy, correct?
That's correct.
And you suggest that sites should be used to meet that requirement, correct?
That's correct.
Based on your understanding of sites operations, would diversions to site limit operations of the State Water Project or Central Valley Project?
Diversions from Sacramento River into sites?
Yes.
Not that I'm aware of, but I haven't analyzed that scenario, so I couldn't say.
Assuming that sites would not limit operations of the SWP and CVP, wouldn't it be true that sites would also not inhibit compliance of the CVP and SWP under D1641?
Could you repeat that, please?
Sure. If we assume that sites would not limit operations of the SWP and CVP, wouldn't it be true that sites would not inhibit compliance of the CVP and SWP with D1641?
Well, I'm not sure exactly if I know how to answer that. Sites is inhibiting, or the ability for the CVP and SWP projects to act as a water storage partners is and storing water within sites that is not going to be used to help meet their existing water quality requirements for their existing permit is what's harming their ability to meet their existing regulations or existing permit requirements.
Whose existing water quality regulations? You're referring to the projects?
I'd be referring to the State Water Research Control Board.
In paragraphs 24 through 26, you discuss how changes in the San Joaquin River make a difference in water quality conditions at Old River at Tracy, correct?
I'm sorry, I was trying to find that on the map. Could you repeat that, please?
Sure. Paragraphs 24 through 26, you discuss how changes in the San Joaquin River make a difference in water quality conditions at Old River at Tracy, correct?
I'm showing how changes in flow at Vernalis can have changes in water quality at Old River at Tracy. I believe that system needs to be evaluated further in order to understand how that relationship works. but that an analysis has never been done by the sites authority, so we don't really know what that relationship would be or how it would work, because it's not likely to work all the time, but under some conditions, it would probably be very beneficial, but we don't know what those periods might be.
And it's your opinion that sites has a responsibility to address the water quality conditions at Old River at Tracy?
I wouldn't say that sites has an obligation. Well, from what I understand, sites is obligated to meet all water quality requirements that exist today and will exist in the future. But I believe the operation of sites is allowing some of their water storage partners to store water that should be used to meet their existing water rights requirements in terms of water quality objectives.
And just to confirm, you understand now that this SWP is not a partner of the site's project?
Okay. I'm not familiar with exactly how those memoranda of understanding are construed, but if you say so, I'll take your word for it.
You state that most exceedances of Old River at Tracy of the D 1641 or 1641 standard occur in late summer. Is that correct?
I'm not sure if I said that or not, but I know they often do exist in late summer. But they can occur anytime during the year.
Can we please go to paragraph 26? Oops, can we go back up to see the text of paragraph 26? Thank you. Do you see line 27 with your discussion of the, excuse me, it's at line 24 through 28 where you discuss specifically that late summer period. Do you see that?
I do.
Is the Old River salinity requirement consistent year-round?
No, it changes from period to period.
It's
I think there's
lower,
two. Oh, go ahead.
It's lower from April to August, correct?
I believe so, yeah. At 0.7 versus 1.0 during the remainder of the year.
What are the primary drivers of salinity at the Old River at Tracy location?
There are many drivers of salinity at that location. There's salinity that comes from the San Joaquin River. There's salinity that comes from water users within the area. There's salinity that comes from groundwater. There's salinity that sometimes comes down from Sacramento River or some of the other adjacent creek rivers and gets trapped in the South Delta area. There are a variety of sources.
Is it your conclusion that an increase in Vernalis flow is the cause of reductions in salinity as shown in figure 17?
I wouldn't say cause, but I think it can be one of the solutions to reducing the high frequency of missed water quality objectives at Old River at Tracy.
So you would agree that because the projects are required to meet lower salinity levels, or excuse me, standards from June to August, it's possible that there are other actions that are influencing the reduction in salinity during that period of time shown in figure 17 other than Vernalis flow, correct?
It was kind of a compound statement. Could you repeat that again, please?
Sure. So because the projects are required to meet lower salinity standards during June to August, it's possible that there are other actions other than Vernalis flow that influence the reduction in salinity during that period of time as shown in figure 17, correct?
It's possible that there are other factors that can help to reduce salinity, but what we've just done here has been able to evaluate that the Vernalis flow has been shown to reduce salinity. So it's one of the elements that I think should be evaluated to determine its effectiveness in being able to help meet the water quality objectives at Old River at Tracy.
And figure 17 shows water years 2020 and 2021, correct?
Water year 2021, which starts in the 2020.
Thank you. If you selected a normal or wet year for figure 17, would the results look similar?
To some extent, yes. I included some of those wet years in SDWA. I believe it's 4. No, it's 5. I included 2019, 2020, 21, 22, 23, and 24. And both 2019 and 23 in that attachment is for a wet year.
Does every reduction in salinity shown in figure 17 have a corresponding increase in Vernalis flow?
I would say no, but the major ones seem to.
Can we please go to the next page, page 24? In figure 18, you compared the Vernalis flow to Old River at Tracy salinity when flow is less than 5,000 CFS during July, August, and September, correct?
That's correct.
And you came up with an R squared value of 0.6918, correct?
That's correct.
And the R squared value is a statistical measure that indicates how well a model fits a set of data, correct?
That's correct.
You don't state in your testimony what model you used, do you?
I believe this was just done in Excel where I plotted up the data and then I had a curve fitting process that, if I can read without my glasses, an exponential equation to match the data to the best possible fit.
Yeah, so it's not a straight line, is it?
No, it's an exponential line.
Does figure 18 tell you anything about the cause behind the relationship between Vernalis flow and salinity?
In itself, no, it doesn't.
So figure 18 shows a correlation based on the model you selected between flows and salinity, but it doesn't explain why, does it?
No, but it begs the question of why is there a correlation at all here? And can that correlation help us to meet the water quality requirements at Old River and Tracy, since we are seeing a relationship between Vernalis? I believe that this whole analysis needs to be tweaked much more than it has been to look at different water years, different flow rates, evaluate the salinity in San Joaquin River. At the same time, we have low flow. And I think you're going to find more factors that come into play, but you might be able to tease out a condition where you can dramatically improve the salinity at Old River, but under a specific set of conditions. This is more of just an indication that there's something here that's worth looking at.
Did you prepare any testimony regarding how changes in salinity affect water users?
No, I didn't.
Did you rely on or cite any analysis prepared by an agricultural or soil expert regarding how changes in salinity affect water users?
And no, I haven't.
In paragraph 27 on page 24, you state that the site's reservoir will worsen the impacts that were detailed in this testimony, correct?
That's correct. The site's reservoir operation will worsen the impacts that were described in this testimony.
Does your testimony contain any quantitative data about the operations of site's reservoir?
No, the amount of exports that they're planning to have hasn't been decided yet, so we weren't able to perform that calculation.
Can we please scroll to paragraph 28? Thank you. And onto the top of page 25, you state that impacts are likely to be worse when evaluated with a hydrodynamic model that accurately, you state that impacts are likely to be worse when evaluated with a hydrodynamic model that accurately reflects the accumulated deposition in the delta channels, correct?
That's correct.
Is there a hydrodynamic model that, in your opinion, accurately reflects the accumulated deposition in the delta channels?
Presently, there isn't one. They have several very good hydrodynamic models that are available, but they haven't been updated with the latest bathymetry to accurately reflect the channel conditions.
You used the DSM-2 model to evaluate changes in flow into Tom Paine Slough, correct?
No, I didn't. I just came up with a rating curve that I developed based on the characteristics of the structure itself.
You used the DSM-2 model in your written testimony, is that correct?
That's correct.
Is it your opinion that your evaluations relying on the DSM-2 model are not accurate?
I'd say that there is some inaccuracy associated with them because even the latest DSM-2 model, which has some improvements over the older model used by the Sites project, still does not accurately reflect the existing conditions in the channel.
In paragraph 29, you state that there is no mention of using the site's project storage volume to help meet the regulatory requirements for projects, correct?
That's correct.
Would you agree that Reclamation, who is a site's participant, can use its share of site storage for delta conditions if it chooses?
I believe that they could probably use their available volume as they see fit. Whether or not they will is another thing altogether.
Is it your opinion that the site's project authority can dictate how its project participants use their share of water, but is refusing to do so?
I'm not sure if I'm familiar with that.
Gonna object is vague and ambiguous.
Sustained.
Is it your opinion that the site's project authority can dictate how its project participants use their share of water?
I'm not familiar with the relationship between the site's project authority and the different participants in the water storage.
Thank you. That's all I have.
All right, thank you, Ms. Chester. And just to confirm, you didn't have any questions for Mr. Wilson?
Mr. Ferguson does.
Oh, okay. I understand now. Mr. Ferguson, if I think it makes sense to go ahead and get started. I realize you may not finish. So,
Okay, sounds good.
thank you. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon, Mr. Wilson.
Good afternoon, Mr. Ferguson. Is my volume good?
Yeah, I can hear you well.
Perfect, thank you.
All right, I would like to ask you some questions about your written testimony starting on pages 7 and 8. And specifically in paragraph 10, you identify a range of deliveries from the sites project that will be rediverted at the Clifton Court 4x and Jones pumping plant, correct?
That's correct.
And with your recent corrections, you note that the total average annual increase in deliveries would be about 100,000 acre feet in all water year types and up to 263,000 acre feet in dry and critically dry years, correct?
That's correct.
So later in the paragraph, you state that the magnitude of rediversion will be on the order of up to 200,000 acre feet per year or up to 350,000 acre feet per year when all factors are considered. Is that correct?
Yes.
So what's the reason for the difference in those numbers, those ranges?
The first number, the 263,000 acre feet, is a mean or average of dry and critically dry years. When I say on the order of up to, now I'm talking about the maximum. So as I state further down in lines 13 and 14, for reference, the Yuba transfer, the Yuba core transfer that I use as reference, has a maximum up to value of 200,000 acre feet, but is not, the average amount is nowhere near the 200,000 acre feet that's actually been moved. And so in trying to do an apples to apples comparison, I looked at trying to determine what would be the maximum acre feet per year. And also in just in accordance with general water rights procedure, the annual acre foot cap is a very common number that's associated with water rights.
So where did you obtain the 350,000 acre foot number from?
I estimated it using my experience in water diversions and releases, that kind of thing.
So can you tell me, kind of step through the process that you used to make that estimation? What did you start with the 263,000?
Correct.
Okay. And so
And
from
then just
there, how did
did
you
an
come up with
estimate.
350,000?
And please, once again,
Mr. Ferguson will have to go back to the question.
Yes. So you say in order to come up with the 350,000 acre foot number, you started with the 263,000 acre feet, which, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And so can you step me through your process for getting to 350,000 acre feet?
Well, without having the individual year data or a kind of an indication of the variability of the data as far as an average, I took a look at similar projects where water's released from storage and rediverted, and also where the conditions in the delta and capacities can change, so you don't divert at maximum amounts all the time, and basically estimated by stepping up a couple of orders of magnitude. So there's no real scientific process behind that. It is more just based on my experience that the maximum amount has to be more than the average.
Okay. So you probably heard Ms. Chester's questions of Mr. Burke regarding whether SITE's project is going to be part of the State Water Project or part of the Central Valley Project, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, and is it on page 8 of your testimony at line 2, you referred to an increase in CVP and SWP deliveries, correct?
That's correct.
But do you understand now that there will not be an increase in CVP or SWP deliveries?
I would disagree with that. It's my understanding based on, can we pull up a table in the from the administrative record?
Sure.
Can we have exhibit AHO 072 and PDF pages? The table is on pages 48 and 49. It's table 5-30.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's take a look at alternative 3, which when I performed this analysis, I was told it was the preferred alternative. So now let's take a look at total sites deliveries to storage partners, and we have north of Delta and south of Delta. So the row for south of Delta, I assumed was the magnitude of sites diversions, the average that would be rediverted, and that would be sites water. Now let's take a look lower, just below that, of CVP operational flexibility. And the mean of dry and critically dry water years in alternative 3 of that is 60,000 acre feet. And then if you could go down to the next page. Oops, I'm not the next page, the end of the call. There you go. If you note the consideration of incidental, there you're perfect. The consideration of incidental change to CVP and SWP deliveries. Incidental change to SWP deliveries is plus 12,000 acre feet mean in dry and critically dry years. So the CVP operational flexibility, as I understand it, is that, say, during a critical year, sites may provide March or April required flows into the Delta. Therefore, water up in Shasta is held back for the summer for temperature concerns. When that water is released and exported, that would be additional that would not have happened, or that would not have happened absent the project. And so those are the two areas of additional water. And I would look finally to the bottom row and the left column. There's total authority, CVP OpFlex, and incidental changes in CVP and SWP deliveries. And that number comes down to 315,000 acre feet. Now, that number is not all cross delta activities, because can we go back up a little bit in the call? If you'll see there are north of delta site storage partners, and there are also north of delta refuge water supply and YOLO bypass habitat water supply that would not be diverted through the South Delta exports or smooth South Delta pumps. But yes, according to my reading of this chart, there is sites water that moves. And if the Bureau if the Bureau becomes the 25% partner that I think is its maximum, then there, as you can look on the row for CVP operational flexibility, that number jumps up to 60 in alternative 3. If there is less Bureau Reclamation participation, there is therefore more independent or independent CVP and SWP contractors who become storage partners. You notice that there is more set water delivery south of Delta, 210,000 acre feet and 221,000 acre feet, as compared to the 168,000 acre feet. So you either got sites water that's going to be diverted, or sites water that will be used to meet objectives, and now there'll be additional water in Shasta, and that water will be diverted. That's not specifically sites water. And additionally, it's not even limited to the transfer window. So that water could be diverted outside of the transfer window.
But do you understand that all of the water being delivered in this table of 530 is under the site's water right, correct?
Even the incidental changes to SWP water supply?
Well, except perhaps for incidental changes that are driven by certain sites' operations.
And what about the CVP operational flexibility?
Well, the water being delivered is, well, I should be answering the question.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
I'm
But,
sorry.
you know, my question.
It's my understanding.
Hold on. Ms. Ferguson, let me ask the question.
Yeah, I just would. Do you agree that CVP and SWP contractors will end up with deliveries of sites water under the sites water right?
Yes.
But they will end up with that water not as a result of operation, or not as a result of CVP or SWP water rights, correct?
Well, again, the incidental change in SWP deliveries would be under the SWP water rights.
But that would be an indirect effect, correct?
Well, it's listed in this table, so I would put that as absent approval of the application, it would not occur.
Okay, I'm going to move on. On page 10 of your testimony, in paragraphs 14 through 16, you conduct an analysis of the impact of sites diversions on Sacramento River flows, correct?
That's correct. Well, let me restate briefly. What I did in this was I used the information the best information I could find in the record to evaluate the impacts to Sacramento River flow from sites diversions. I don't know if that's any clearer.
Okay. So in lines 19 through 23, you state that during 4 of the 5 water years analyzed, the table 2 objectives for protection of ag beneficial uses were exceeded for significant portions of the summer months. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then you offer SDWA 73 as evidence of those exceedances. Is that correct?
Yes.
Are you able to explain to me how you interpret when there's an exceedance in the table 2 objectives for the South Delta agricultural beneficial uses?
Okay. I just defined an exceedance as when the measured value that I downloaded from CDEC was higher than the objective. And let me add just to note, if CDEC data is downloaded, it will come, for example, in units that will give you 700, and that is equal to 0.7. And I just want to point out that you have to make a note to round correctly. And so that if you download a day that had, or you calculate a 30-day average for one day that's 749, you round that to 0.7. If it's 750, you round up to 0.8, and that would exceed the value of the objective.
So the South Delta salinity objectives are assessed on a 30-day running average. Is that correct?
Yes.
And are you familiar with the rule stated in footnote 2 in table 2 about how to evaluate that 30-day running average? This is within D1641.
41. Yes, but can you pull that up for us?
Yeah, let's do that. It's AHO 277. And let's turn to PDF page 194, please. So my understanding, Mr. Wilson, is that footnote 2 at the bottom of this page explains how to implement an assessment of the 30-day running average and to determine compliance using that 30-day average. Is that your understanding?
Correct.
Okay. So is it your understanding that if on the last day of a 30-day averaging period, the objective is not exceeded, that whole month, for that whole month, there's not considered to be an exceedance of the objective?
Can you repeat that for me?
Is your understanding of footnote 2 that if on the last day of the month, the 30-day running average is not exceeded, that there is then not an exceedance for the entire month?
No, that's not my understanding. And also, I'd like to add that in looking at the exceedances and the numbers that I plotted, if you look at South Delta or Central Delta irrigator trying to irrigate their crops, the objective is created on a 30-day running average, and is done by that for reasons of creation of an objective in balancing beneficial uses. When you're looking at injury to other legal users of water, that the crops are going to see the EC that's diverted on that day. And so I broke down the 30-day running average just to show an indication of what the numbers are. But if you look at the daily averages and then look into what is an injury to another legal user of water, the averaging period and the procedure that's contained in footnote 2, again, was created as part of a process to balance beneficial uses, but isn't necessarily always going to protect a legal user of water from an impact based on a change having to do with a proposed project.
But my understanding of your analysis in SDWA 73 is that you compared the results to this objective in order to reach a conclusion that there were exceedances, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so in order to make that determination, it would be appropriate to follow the rules that are articulated for that 30-day running average analysis, correct?
Yes.
Okay, and do you believe you've done that here in SDWA 73?
I believe that SDWA 73 shows a very good indication of the water quality conditions in the South Delta over the period of time that from 2008 to 2023.
Okay, can we bring up SDWA 73 and take a quick look? So can we please scroll down and go to the OLD tab, please? And now scroll down. So can we stop, please? Thank you. Mr. Wilson, I'm looking at the 2008 year as an example of your analysis. And my understanding, first of all, from reading footnote 2 in D1641 is that you are to start the analysis on the first day of the month, correct? For your 30-day running average?
No, I calculated the 30-day running average on a daily basis.
Okay, is the compliance period starts in April, correct?
The objective is year round.
Yeah, sorry.
You're
right. The April through I think August is 0.7 in D1641, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And so where you show a yellow shading, this is intended to show where the objectives was exceeded, correct?
That's correct.
So for example, on April, well, can you explain to me why you shaded
The
March
30th
30th, 2008 in yellow?
the 30th and 31st should not be shaded under my the way I analyze that. That's an error.
Okay. Okay, so all right, can we scroll down just a little bit? Can we go down to the end of April? Okay, thank you. Can you tell me how you made the determination that the days of April 1st through April 21st, 2008 should be shaded in yellow?
Merely because they were above 750 units that are given, but yes.
And is that based on a 30-day running average?
Yes. So the number, for example, the numbers in column D are the 30-day running average of the numbers in column C.
For the month of April, you didn't assess the 30-day running average for April by looking at the 30-day average on April 30th. It doesn't sound like, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And you believe your approach is consistent with footnote 2 and table 2?
I believe my approach is consistent with evaluation for an injury to other legal users of water.
Well, again, my understanding of your testimony is that you were identifying exceedances for significant portions of summer months on page 10, line 23, correct?
Correct.
And so to do that, you used the objectives and the averaging rule that's set forth in table 2, or you attempted to, is that correct?
Yes, and additionally looked at the values and looked at the time period. So for example, I mean, we're not in the summer months in this specific example we're working through.
But the point in the presentation of this testimony was to show time when there have been exceedances of the objective in table 2, correct?
Correct.
And you believe that the shading in yellow on this tab and the other 2 tabs for the other 2 compliance points is an accurate reflection of application of the 30-day averaging period for the table 2 South Delta salinity objectives. Is that fair?
Yes.
So my understanding is you used AHO 49. We can take down SDWA 73. My understanding is you used AHO 49 for your analysis of changes in flow in the Sacramento River. Is that correct?
Yes, I found that to be the most useful presentation of information in the administrative record at the time when we did the case in chief in July.
And do you understand that the historical tool is not an operations model?
Yes.
And you understand that it simulates maximum possible diversions?
Yes. And also I believe that in looking at injury and evaluating injury, the first thing I would look at is the maximum possible period, and then scope down from there. So that's that's part of my, just experience in evaluating injury to other legal uses of water, that you'd look at the most potential and then scope, look down further. So.
Okay. So my understanding of your analysis in paragraphs 14 through 16 is that you're attempting to connect sites diversions from the Sacramento River to exceedances of water quality objectives at the South Delta salinity compliance locations. Is that correct?
I'm going to hold on, Mr. Ferguson. I'm going to interrupt you because I think we're moving on to a new section and we're at 456.
Okay.
I think this might be a good breaking point, and I wanted to jump in before we get into this.
Okay.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Wilson. My intent is to pick up at 9 a.m. essentially exactly where we left off. Is there anything in the next 3 minutes that we need to address before we adjourn and then reconvene tomorrow morning?
I don't think so.
Great. Thank you.
Hearing Officer Kinsey.
Yes.
Sorry, I don't know why my picture went upside down, but I turned it off because it was confusing. But I'm trying to work with Dr. Herbold about when he might go on. So I guess it would be helpful to have an updated cross exam, just so I can ballpark with Dr. Herbold when he might come on, which he would be after Mr. Nomalini, I believe.
Yes, at least that's what was reflected to me this earlier.
Right.
Maybe this question, Mr. Ferguson, how much more do you think you have?
I'd say at least an hour.
Okay.
45 minutes to an hour.
And then I know, let's see, Mr. Soderlund, do you have an updated estimate based on the questions that we've had so far? I know it's a little difficult. That may not be a fair question.
I think I could stay around an hour for me, for Mr. Burke and Mr. Wilson. Depending on how the answers go, but.
Right. Understood. Thank you. And then Ms. Mitchell, can you remind me of the Bureau's estimate or if it's changed?
Estimate was 30 minutes.
Thank you. And then Ms. Mendel-Rice.
It's a little hard to say since we're going last in this. I think we had initially estimated, somewhere around an hour between the two, but I think we could safely probably stay within about a half an hour. My guess is people are going to cover a lot of the ground.
So thank you. I appreciate that. It sounds like Mr. Herbold, if he comes on, it's going to be very late in the day. We'll have a better estimate at lunch, but it seems maybe unlikely that we'll get to him tomorrow, depending.
Okay. Thank you very much.
I hope that helps. Great. It is 4:58. I appreciate all of you, and we are adjourned. I will see you tomorrow at 9 o'clock. Thank you.